The reason I am not giving you a sentience score is the error bars are so large right now that like it's almost a meaningless number. Because I'm waiting on so much evidence. And so I think that's really an essential feature of it for me. The second thing is that I worry, especially as an expert, that that number would be overemphasized. Somebody would inevitably put into a spreadsheet and they would use that spreadsheet to make all kinds of decisions. And that number does not reflect the complexity that you and I have now spent 3 hours discussing and barely scratched the surface of. I want to talk about the nuance, and a number does not demonstrate that. And I think it's important also that we understand that if you have updated kind of at all towards insects plausibly being sentient, scale takes the rest of the issue for you to a serious place. There are so many of them that if you take it seriously at all, then you need to be thinking that this is an issue to work on.
Hey listeners, Luisa here. You were just listening to Meghan Barrett, an insect neurobiologist whose mind-blowing facts about insects really opened my eyes about the likelihood of invertebrate sentience when I interviewed her last year. We're back today with another compilation of our favorite bits from past shows, this time on a topic that listeners might know I'm absolutely captivated by: consciousness and sentience in non-human minds, including digital ones. Over the last few years, this area of study has really taken off, and many of the guests you'll hear from in this episode are pioneers in their fields. Whether they're entomologists, philosophers, machine learning researchers, or neuroscientists, they're all studying angles on slippery questions like what consciousness is, even in humans, how we'd recognize it in minds unlike our own, and how much we should worry about other beings' ability to experience pleasure and pain. You'll hear from David Chalmers on why artificial consciousness is possible, Jeff Sebo on what the threshold is for AI systems meriting moral consideration, Jonathan Birch on how we very recently thought newborns couldn't feel pain and how we're likely making similar mistakes today, Robert Long on how we might stumble into causing enormous suffering for digital minds, Meghan Barrett on the evolutionary origins of consciousness and sentience and whether brain size and sentience are related, plus many more. You also may notice that this is a pretty long episode. We decided not to cut it down more, given that this issue is really important, and long episodes on this topic haven't deterred listeners in the past. On the contrary, actually, our 4-hour and 40-minute marathon session with David Chalmers was one of our most popular episodes ever. All right, I hope you enjoy.
Robert Long on what we should picture when we think about artificial sentience.
I basically don't feel like I have a great sense of what artificial sentience would even look like. Can you help me get a picture of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely fine and correct to not know what it would look like. In terms of what we're talking about, I think the short answer, or like a short hook into it, is just think about the problem of animal sentience. I think that's structurally very similar. So we share the world with a lot of non-human animals, and they look a lot different than we do. They act a lot differently than we do. They're somewhat similar to us. We're made of the same stuff. They have brains, but we often face this question of, as we're looking at a bee going through the field, like we can tell that it's doing intelligent behavior, but we also wonder, is there something it's like to be that bee? Like, and if so, what are its experiences like? And what would that entail for how we should like treat bees or try to share the world with bees? I think the general problem of AI sentience is that question, and also harder. So I'm thinking of it in terms of, there's this kind of new class of intelligent or intelligent seeming complex system. And in addition to wondering what they're able to do and how they do it, we can also, I think, wonder if there is or will ever be something that it's like to be them, and if they'll have experiences, if they'll have something like pain or pleasure. It's a natural question to occur to people, and it's occurred to me, and I've been trying to work on it in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I guess I have almost even more basic question, which is like, yeah, when we talk about AI sentience, both kind of in the short term and in the long term, are we talking about like a thing that looks like my laptop that has like a code on it that like has been coded to have some kind of feelings or experience?
Yeah, sure. I think I use the term artificial sentience. So like very generally, it's just like things that are made out of different stuff than us. And in particular, silicone and like the computational hardware that we run these things on. Could things built out of that and running computations on that have experiences? So like the most straightforward case to imagine would probably be a robot, because there you can kind of clearly think about what the physical system is that you're trying to ask if it's sentient. Things are a lot kind of more complicated with the more disembodied AI systems of today, like ChatGPT, because there it's like a virtual agent in a certain sense. And brain emulations would also be like virtual agents. But I think for all of those, you can ask at some level of description or some way of carving up the system, like, is there any kind of subjective experience here? Is there consciousness here? Is there sentience here?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I guess the reason I'm asking is because, I think I just have like for a long time had this sense that like when people use the term digital minds or artificial sentience, I have like some vague images that kind of come from sci-fi, but I mostly feel like I don't even know what we're talking about. But it sounds like it could just look like a bunch of different things. And the like core of it is something that is sentient in maybe a way similar, maybe a way that's pretty different to humans, but that exists not in biological form, but in some grouping that's made up of silicone. Is that basically right?
And I should say, I guess like silicon is not like that deep here.
Sure.
Yeah, something having to do with like running on computers, running on GPUs.
Yeah.
I'm sure I could slice and dice it, and you could get into all sorts of philosophical like classification terms for things. But yeah, that's the general thing I'm pointing at. And I in particular have been working on the question of AI systems. So the questions about like whole brain emulations, I think would be different, because we would have something that at some level of description is extremely similar to the human brain by definition. And then you could wonder about whether it matters that it's an emulated brain. And people have wondered about that. In the case of AIs is, even harder, because not only are they made on different stuff and maybe somewhat virtual, they also are kind of strange and not necessarily working along the same principles as the human brain.
Jeff Sebo on what the threshold is for AI systems meriting moral consideration.
The general case for extending moral consideration to AI systems is that they might be conscious or sentient or agential or otherwise significant. And if they might have those features, then we should extend them at least some moral consideration in the spirit of caution and humility. So the standard should not be, do they definitely matter? It should also not be, do they probably matter? It should be, is there a reasonable, non-negligible chance that they matter given the information available? And once we clarify that that is the bar for moral inclusion, then it becomes much less obvious that AI systems will not be passing that bar anytime soon.
Yeah, I feel kind of confused about how to think about that bar, where I think you're using the term non-negligible chance. I'm curious, what is a negligible chance? Where is the line? At what point is something non-negligible?
Yeah, this is a perfectly reasonable question. This is somewhat of a term of art in philosophy and decision theory, and we might not be able to very precisely or reliably say exactly where the threshold is between non-negligible risks and negligible risks. But what we can say as a starting point is that a risk can be quite low, the probability of harm can be quite low, and it can still be worthy of some consideration. So for example, why is driving drunk wrong? Not because it will definitely kill someone, not even because it will probably kill someone. It might have only a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of killing someone. But if driving drunk has a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of killing someone against their will unnecessarily, that can be reason enough to get an Uber or a Lyft or stay where I am and sober up. It at least merits consideration, and it can even in some situations be decisive. So as a starting point, we can simply acknowledge that in some cases, a risk can be as low as 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, and it can still merit consideration.
Yeah, right. It does seem totally clear and good that regularly in our daily lives, we consider small risks of big things that might be either very good or very bad. And we think that's just like clearly worth doing and sensible. Sometimes, probably in personal experience, I may not do it as much as I should, but like on reflection, I certainly endorse it. And so I guess the thinking is here that given that there's the potential for many, many, many beings with the potential for sentience, albeit some small likelihood, it's kind of at that point that we might start wanting to give them moral consideration. I guess, do you want to say exactly what moral consideration is warranted at that point?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it actually breaks down into multiple questions. One is a question about moral weight. We already have a sense that we should give different moral weights to beings with different welfare capacities. If an elephant can suffer much more than an ant, then the elephant should get priority over the ant to that degree. Should we also give more moral weight to beings who are more likely to matter in the first place? If an elephant is 90% likely to matter and an ant is 10% likely to matter, should I also give the elephant more weight for that reason? And then another question is what these beings might even want and need in the first place. What would it actually mean to treat an AI system well if they were sentient or otherwise morally significant? That question is going to be very difficult to answer. So there are no immediate implications to the idea that we should give some moral consideration to AI systems if they have a non-negligible chance of being sentient. All that it means is that we should give them at least some weight when making decisions that affect them. And then we might disagree about how much weight and what follows from that.
Meghan Barrett on the evolutionary argument for insect sentience.
Importantly, I think another fact that a lot of people don't realize from this evolutionary perspective is that insects are thus actually most closely related to crustaceans, right? So they form this group together called the Pancrustacea, and that group shares a common ancestor.
Got it.
So I think that's something else that people should consider if you're somebody who takes crustacean sentience seriously, and sentience is a trait that has evolved, right? It didn't just appear in organisms as they are today, which I'm sure will be something we repeatedly touch on throughout this episode. If you're somebody who believes that crustaceans are given the benefit of the doubt for you for sentience, then you might also think that insects are worth giving the benefit of the doubt for some reasons as well from an evolutionary perspective. And there are two possible hypotheses you could entertain here. One is the idea that, like, okay, sentience evolved exactly one time, and so everybody descended from that common ancestor, unless maybe they lost it for some reason, has that characteristic. So if you accept both vertebrates and any of the inverts, so a cephalopod or a decapod, if you're convinced on a single invertebrate and you also are convinced on a single origin point for this, you have a problem, right? And this is because the closest common ancestor to all of those folks is very far back. And so you're going to have all your insects, all your nematodes, all your decapods, all your annelids, which are another kind of worm, included if you believe that there's one common ancestor and no loss events. Now, maybe you think there's loss events, but now you're talking about multiple loss events because there's so many invertebrates. So you're going to have to justify each of those losses, which you could potentially do. Another possible hypothesis is that sentience evolved multiple times independently in different groups. And I would probably say this is more plausible in my view, in part because we see multiple emergence of things all the time in evolutionary history. So like vision is a great example where we know that eyes might have evolved as many as 40 times during animal evolutionary history. And then when we think about the development of eyes, it's crucial to consider how they all generate the same basic function of being able to, see something, even though they may vary in a lot of ways structurally. So for instance, we saw the multiple emergence of what we call these crystalline lenses in the eyes of animals. Some were made from co-opting calcite, others were made by co-opting heat shock proteins, still others were made by co-opting other novel proteins. All of them make these crystalline lenses, right? Or you could consider that independent but convergent evolution of similar structures in vertebrate eyes and spider eyes. And that can result in, again, the same basic capacity to see something. And of course, then we can talk about how the exact functions of seeing using these different structures or similar structures can vary, like, acuity can vary or wavelengths that the animal can sense can vary. But still, we think that same basic capacity of some kind of sight is there for all of these animals. So, okay, this is all to say that it makes it more complicated if we're looking for something like consciousness. So the function we're interested in is consciousness instead of vision, right? Now we're saying, if there's more than one origin point, now we need to be looking for potentially divergent structures capable of producing that common basic function. And of course, that common basic function can have lots of variance and gradation. And we don't even have a good grasp yet on human consciousness. So you can see how acknowledging the possibility of multiple independent origins would then make this all very challenging to figure out. But in any case, I think when you look at this from an evolutionary perspective, it's important to consider who's a close relative, who are your common ancestors for that group. When you think these characteristics evolved, why do you think they evolved there? And then if you're somebody who takes crustaceans seriously, given that their close relation is the insects, you're going to need to seriously consider the hexapods too.
Andrés Jiménez Zorrilla on whether there's something it's like to be a shrimp.
How do shrimp farmers feel about their shrimp? Do they kind of naturally care about their well-being or see them as, moral patients that can suffer?
Yeah, that's something that surprised us, at least the percentage when we did a survey in India. We ran, it's a small sample, but 95% of the farmers that we asked whether they felt that their shrimps could feel pain and stress, 95% of them said yes.
Huh.
One of them actually had a very endearing answer saying that he spent more time with his animals than he did with his family. And that if his shrimps suffered, he said, I also suffer. So it's very interesting. And on the other hand, I think it's unsurprising because these people spend a significant amount of time seeing the behavior of the animals. And they're much less skewed than, I guess, consumers who'd never see them alive are.
Right.
I'm almost betting that you or your audience very rarely have they ever seen an image of a shrimp that's alive and swimming, other than most of them will have just seen them in cocktails.
Right.
And these farmers just see them all the time. They see them when they're sick, they see them when they're feeding, when they're swimming about, so they really cared about them.
I see. So they're exposed and seeing shrimp all the time. And I guess it sounds like their behavior is moderately complicated, that they're doing interesting things that make them seem smart enough and I guess reactive and responsive enough to circumstances that it's very natural to feel that they can suffer or experience pleasure the same way that dogs or pigs do.
Exactly. I couldn't have put it better. It's very difficult to see them in farms because the water in which they're raised is typically has
murky.
High turbidity. So it's very murky. But once you actually see them sometimes in tanks and in trade conferences and things like that, when they're fed, they swim, they catch their feed, they take it to a little corner where each of them can kind of eat it in peace. It's very rare to see them behaving. And there's good research ongoing to understand behavioral issues of shrimps. It's underway.
I see. So maybe they're more perhaps like crabs or lobsters or octopus even than one might imagine in terms of just like how their behavior looks.
I think exactly that was the argument that the scientists at the London School of Economics made when they wrote this paper for the UK Sentience Bill recently in November last year. They did a full review of the evidence of sentience of cephalopod mollusks and decapods, which are the ones that you exactly mentioned. And what they find out is that for those species that have been extensively researched, there is very good evidence that they're sentient. And what they say is the evidence in some other species is not as strong, but it's only because they haven't been researched for kind of sentience purposes as much as other species, like, for example, crabs and octopuses, as you said.
Yeah, I guess what sort of criteria are they using? Or like, when they study a species to try to figure out whether it's sentient, what sort of things are they looking at to try to reach an evaluation?
Yeah, that's a good point because it's very difficult to have a smoking gun that tells you that an animal is sentient, right? So in this specific case, what they did is they looked at, I believe it was 8 different indicators of sentience. And those included whether they had nociceptors, so the right body parts to detect noxious stimuli, whether they had protective behaviors, adaptive behaviors, if anesthesia was applied to certain body parts, whether the reaction changed, which would indicate that it's not a reflex, things like that. And then they ranked whether the evidence was very high to moderately low, etc., for each individual species. And then they came up with an overall assessment that all cephalopods and decapods should be protected by UK animal welfare law, and eventually they did. And this was a report that was commissioned by the UK government to the London School of Economics, so it was a very independent type research.
Yeah. Okay, so shrimp, they kind of they respond to injuries, they probably learn from negative experiences that they have. Did they respond to anesthetic? I know that's one of the tests that people sometimes use.
So yeah, exactly. There's a paper that shows the responses that different decapods have to anesthetics, as you said. And I think With shrimps in particular, what they do is they pinch one of the antennas. They see how they behave, like they flick their tails, they jump out of the water, etc. And then in a second stage, they apply anesthetics and repeat the experiment. And the behavior changes significantly. Like the time that they rub their little antenna is much, much lower. They probably swim normally quicker and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so they're tending to injuries, and then they also tend to them less when they're given anesthetic. Just as an aside, it's remarkable to me that anesthetics that we've presumably developed for humans also work on shrimp. Like they're so far away in the phylogenetic tree of life, and yet so much of the basic machinery of feeling seems to be very, very like similar enough.
That's true. One of the arguments that some people made exactly used to be, well, opioids don't necessarily work the same in some of the animals, but as you say, not necessarily all of the anesthetics need to work the same, but researchers have found anesthetics that do apply and do have an effect on animals, and it changes behavior. Yeah.
An audience member was curious to know, do you feel viscerally motivated by the prospect of shrimp suffering, or is your interest and motivation somewhat more on the intellectual side?
So until very recently, my response would have been completely intellectual side. It was not until I visited farm. I think most of us during our lifetimes will never visit a shrimp farm, or most people in the world would not visit a shrimp farm or see a shrimp being taken out of the water. When my co-founder, our program director in India, and myself, we went to see what is called harvesting, which is the moment in which the animals are scooped out of the water and eventually kind of put in crates and things like that. That process to me made me also viscerally care about this issue.
Yeah.
But it definitely came through the more intellectual part, yeah.
Jonathan Birch on the cautionary tale of newborn pain.
Let's turn to another edge case of sentience in humans. So fetuses. You start the section of the book with what you call the cautionary tale of newborn pain. Can you talk me through that case?
It's another case I found unbelievable. That in the 1980s, it was still apparently common to perform surgery on newborn babies without anesthetic on both sides of the Atlantic. And this led to appalling cases and to public outcry and to campaigns to change clinical practice. So there's a public campaign led by someone called Jill Lawson, whose baby son had been operated on in this way and had died. And at the same time, evidence being gathered to bear on the questions by some pretty courageous scientists, I would say, who got a lot of, they got very heavily attacked for doing this work, but they knew evidence was needed to change clinical practice. And they showed that, well, if this protocol is done, that massive stress responses in the baby, massive stress responses that reduce the chances of survival and lead to long-term developmental damage. And so, as soon as they looked for evidence, the evidence showed that this practice was completely indefensible, and then the clinical practice was changed. So in a way, people don't need convincing anymore that we should take newborn human babies seriously as sentience candidates. But the tale is a useful cautionary tale because it shows you how deep that overconfidence can run and how problematic it can be. It just underlines this point that overconfidence about sentience is everywhere and is dangerous.
Yeah, it really does. I'm sure that had I lived in a different time, I'd at least have been much more susceptible to this particular mistake. But from where I'm standing now, it's impossible for me to imagine thinking that newborns don't feel pain and therefore you can do massively invasive surgery on them without anesthetic.
It's a hard one to believe, isn't it? Of course, the consideration was sometimes made that anesthesia has risks, and of course it does. But operating without anesthesia also has risks. And so there was real naivety about how the surgeons here were thinking about risk. And It's what philosophers of science sometimes called the epistemology of ignorance. They were worried about the risks of anesthesia, which is their job to worry about that. So they just neglected the risks on the other side.
Right.
That's the truly unbelievable thing.
So the kind of clinical updates that happened since, my sense is that now it is standard procedure to give newborns anesthetic during surgeries and that the benefits outweigh the risks. You argue that wasn't inevitable. What's the case for that?
Well, I think the public outcry also mattered. Clinical norms are very, very hard to shift. If it was really just these two people, Anand and Hickey, against the medical establishment, that's not really how change happens. We talk about theories of change sometimes and just get the evidence and take it to the establishment. It's not a good theory of change. I think in this case, the fact that there was at the same time a powerful public campaign going on based on these horrible stories, that is why clinical practice got changed very quickly.
So there's a lesson there. Yeah, I mean, there's really nothing to say, but that's horrific and important to know it happened because we may be doing it again.
David Chalmers on why artificial consciousness is possible.
I mean, some people think that no, say, silicon-based computational system can be conscious because, say, biology is required. I'm inclined to reject views like that. And there's nothing special about the biology here. And one way to think about that is to think about cases of gradual uploading. You replace your neurons one at a time by silicon chips that play the same role. I think cases like this make it particularly hard to say that if you say that the system at the other end is not conscious, then you have to say that consciousness either gradually fades out or during this process, or it suddenly disappears during this process. And I think it's at least difficult to maintain either of those lines. You could take the line that maybe silicon will never even be able to simulate biological neurons very well, even in terms of its effects. Maybe there's some special dynamic properties that biology has that silicon could never have. As far as I think that would be very surprising because it looks like all the laws of physics we know about right now are computational. Roger Penrose has entertained the idea that's false. But if we assume that physics is computational, that one can in principle simulate the action of a physical system, then one ought to at least be able to create one of these gradual uploading processes. And then someone who denies that the system at the other end could be conscious is going to have to say either it fades out in a really weird way during this process, you go through half consciousness, quarter consciousness, while your behavior stays the same, or that it suddenly disappears at some point. You replace the magic neuron and it disappears. So those are my arguments. Those are arguments I gave years ago now for why I think a silicon duplicate of us can be conscious in principle.
I think I see why the sudden disappearance of consciousness in that scenario seems kind of implausible. It's like, well, what's so special about that magic neuron? But I don't immediately see why the gradual fade out of consciousness isn't a reasonable possibility to entertain there.
So how are you thinking the gradual fade out would go? We'd lose visual consciousness, then we'd lose auditory consciousness? Or
I don't know, obviously, exactly how it would go, but if we assume that consciousness can come in degrees, then why can't it disappear in degrees?
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking that let's put some crude measure on a state of consciousness, like the number of bits involved in your state of consciousness. One way of imagining it fading is somehow lowering in intensity, and then suddenly the intensity goes to zero and it all disappears. That, to me, sounds like a version of sudden disappearance because the bits would still go from a million bits to 0 bits all at once. Strange in the way that sudden disappearance is strange. So maybe looking more continuous, then somehow the number of bits in your consciousness has to gradually decrease. You go from 1 million bits to 100,000 to 10,000 to whatever. And how would this work? I mean, maybe my visual field would gradually lose distinctions, would gradually become more coarse-grained. Maybe bits of it would disappear. Maybe one modality would go and then another modality. But anyway, you're going to have these weird intermediate states where you say the system is conscious, is saying it is fully conscious of all these things because its behavior is the same. I am visually conscious in full detail. I'm auditorily conscious. And in fact, their conscious state is going to be a very, very pale reflection of the conscious state they're talking about with very few, say, bits of consciousness. That situation is the one that strikes me as especially strange. A conscious being that appears to be fully rational and believes it's in this fully conscious state. In fact, it's in a very, very limited conscious state. If you're an illusionist, you might think this kind of thing happens to you all the time.
So I think this is totally wrong, but you could have a view where like the brain, so there's like information processing going on in the transmission between the neurons, and that's what's generating the behavior. But then there's like some other secret source that's happening in the brain that we don't understand and that we would not then replicate on the silicon chips. So as you go replacing like each neuron and each of the synapse with like the machine version of it, the information processing continues as before and the behavior remains the same. But like you've lost the part that was generating the consciousness, you haven't engineered that into the computer components. And so just gradually the consciousness disappears.
I can certainly, I can imagine this is at least conceivable. But then what are you going to say about the intermediate cases? Will there will have to be cases where the being is conscious and is massively wrong about its own consciousness? Is that what it says you're not having experiences of bright red and green and orange right now, and in fact it's having a uniform gray visual field or something like that?
Seems possible, right?
I guess I also don't find it as implausible as you seem to, Dave, that we could be wrong about our conscious experience or how much conscious experience we're having in this gradual uploading example.
That's fair. And there certainly are many cases where people are very wrong about their own conscious experiences. So certainly there are all kinds of pathologies where people, there's blindness denial, where people say they're having all kinds of visual experiences when it appears that they're blind, they're not having them. So maybe it could be like this. I mean, this is strange because functionally the system doesn't seem to have any pathologies. Anyway, I do allow that this is conceivable, and I certainly can't prove that it couldn't happen. The more open you are to beings being very, very wrong about their consciousness, maybe you'll be more open to this case. Here's one thing I'll say at the very least. If this actually happens and we go through it and our behavior is the same throughout, then we have beings whose heads are, first a quarter silicon, then a half silicon, and so on. They say, everything is fine. My conscious experience is exactly the way it was. They're telling us this. They're talking to us. They update every week with a bit more silicon, and we keep talking to them. We are going to be completely convinced that, very nearly completely convinced that they are conscious throughout. It's going to become impossible to deny it. So at least as a matter of sociology, I think this view is likely to become the obvious seeming view.
Holden Karnofsky and how we'll see digital people as people.
Let's talk about these digital people. What do you mean by digital people?
Yeah, so the basic idea of a digital person is like a digital simulation of a person. So it's really like if you just take, one of these video games like The Sims or, I use the example of a football game because I was able to get these different pictures of this football player, Jerry Rice, as every year they put out a new Madden, video game. And so Jerry Rice looks a little more realistic every year. It's like you have these like video game simulations of people. And if you just imagine it getting more and more realistic until you have a perfect simulation. So you imagine like a video game that has a character called Holden and just does everything exactly how Holden would in response to whatever happens. That's it. That's what a digital person is. So it's a fairly simple idea, and it just in some ways is a very far out extrapolation of stuff we're already doing, which is what we're already kind of like simulating these characters.
I guess that'd be one way to look at it. I guess the way I've usually heard it discussed or introduced is the idea that, well, we have these brains and they're doing calculations, and couldn't we eventually figure out how to basically do all of the same calculations that the brain is doing in a simulation of the brain moving around? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you would have a simulated brain in a simulated environment, and that is another. Yeah, absolutely, that's another way to think of it.
So this is kind of a fairly out there technology, the idea that we would be, able to reproduce like a full human being, or at least like the most important parts of a human being running on a server. I think that is likely to be possible.
I mean, I think it's kind of similar to what I said before, is we have this existence proof, we have these brains, there's lots of them, and all we're trying to do is kind of build a computer program that can process information just how a brain would. And so if you kind of imagine like a really expensive and dumb way of doing it would be to just simulate the brain in all its detail, just simulate everything that's going on in the brain. There may just be smarter and easier ways to do it where you capture the level of abstraction that matters. So maybe it doesn't matter what every single molecule in the brain is doing. Maybe a lot of that stuff is kind of random. And what really is going on that's interesting or important or doing computational work in the brain is maybe the neurons firing and some other stuff. And, you could simulate that. So But basically, there's this process going on. It's going on in a pretty small physical space. We have tons of examples of it. We can literally study animal brains. We could just we do. I mean, neuroscientists just pick them apart and try to study them and see what's going on inside them. And so I'm not saying we're close to being able to do this, but when I try to think about why would it be impossible? Why would it be impossible to build an artifact, to build a digital artifact or a computer that's processing information just how a brain would? And, I guess I just come up empty and I can't prove it. I can't prove that this is possible. But the basic argument is just it's here, it's all around us. Why wouldn't we be able to, to kind of simulate it at some point in time?
Are you envisaging these digital people as, being conscious like you and me, or is it more like an automaton situation?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's come up is when I describe this kind of idea of a world of digital people, a lot of people have the intuition, well, even if digital people were able to act just like real people, they wouldn't count morally the same way. They wouldn't have feelings. They wouldn't have experiences. They wouldn't be conscious. We shouldn't care about them. And that's an intuition that I disagree with. It's not a huge focus of the series, but I do write about it. And my understanding from, I think basically if you dig all the way into philosophy of mind and think about what consciousness is, this is something we're all very confused about. No one has the answer to that. But I think in general, there isn't a great reason to think that whatever consciousness is, that it crucially relies on being made out of neurons instead of being made out of microchips or whatever. And one way of thinking about this is I think I'm conscious. And why do I think that? And is the fact that I think I'm conscious, is that connected to the actual truth of me being conscious? Because the thing that makes me think I'm conscious has nothing to do with whether my brain is made out of neurons. If you made a digital copy of me and you said, hey, Holden, are you conscious? That thing would say, yes, of course I am, for the same exact reason I'm doing it. It would be processing all the same information. It'd be considering all the same evidence, and it would say yes. And so there's this intuition that whatever it is consciousness is, if we believe it's what's causing us to think we're conscious, then it seems like it's something about the software our brain is running or the algorithm it's doing or the information it's processing. It's not something about the material the brain is made of, because if you change that material, you wouldn't get different answers, you wouldn't get different beliefs. So that's the intuition. I'm not going to go into it a ton more than that. There's kind of a thought experiment that's kind of, interesting that I think I got from David Chalmers, where you imagine that if you took your brain and you just replaced one neuron with a digital signal transmitter that just fired in all the same exact ways, that you wouldn't notice anything changing. You couldn't notice anything changing because your brain would be doing all the same things and you'd be reaching all the same conclusions. You'd be having all the same thoughts. And then if you replaced another one, you wouldn't notice anything. And if you replaced them all, you wouldn't notice anything. And so anyway, so I think there's some arguments out there. It's not a huge focus of the series. And I don't have a lot more to say about it for now, but I think it is the better bet that if we had digital people that were acting just like us and the brains were doing the same, the digital brains were doing the same thing as our brains, that we should care about them and we should think of them as people, and we probably would. So even if they weren't
because
conscious,
they would act, yeah.
I mean, yeah, well, we'd be friends.
They
with
would
them.
complain.
I mean, we'd talk
the same way that
we would relate to them. It would just be, there are people I've never met, and they would just be like any other people I've never met, but I could have video calls with them and phone calls with them, and so we probably will and should care about what happens to them. And even if we don't, it only changes some of the conclusions. But I basically think that digital people would be people too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the argument that jumps to mind for me is if you're saying, well, to be people, to be conscious, to have value, it has to be run on meat. It has to be run on these cells, like with these electrical charges going back and forth. It'd be like, did evolution just happen to stumble on the one material that could do this? Evolution presumably didn't choose to use this particular design because you'd be conscious. So why would there be this coincidence that we have the one material out of all of the different materials that can do these calculations that produces more value?
That's an interesting way of thinking of it. I mean, if I were to kind of devil's advocate, I would be like, well, maybe every material has its own kind of consciousness and we only care about the kind that's our kind or something. But then that would be an interesting question, why we only care about our kind.
Jeff Sebo on grappling with our biases and ignorance when thinking about sentience.
Let's actually talk about another paper of yours, The Repugnant Conclusion. I love that title, by the way.
Thank you.
And in the paper, you basically ask, suppose that we determine that large animals like humans have more welfare on average, but that small animals like insects have more welfare in total. What follows for ethics and politics? And the paper focuses on small animals like nematodes, but the same question is relevant to AI systems that might end up being super numerous, perhaps because they're used all over the economy. But that might also have some non-negligible chance of experiencing pain and pleasure.
So let's start with the case that you actually focus on in the paper, which is small animals. How should we think about this case?
Yeah, I think we can start really at the end of the last exchange about ways of striking a balance if we worry about the harms of false positives and false negatives. One thing that you can note is even if I include insects and AI systems and other types of beings in my moral circle, even if I give them moral consideration, I might still be able to prioritize beings like me for different reasons. One of them is that I might have a higher capacity for welfare than an insect or an AI system. So I have a more complex brain and a longer lifespan than an insect. And so I can experience more happiness and suffering at any given time, as well as over time. And humans in general, I might think, are more likely to be sentient and morally significant given the evidence available to me than insects, AI systems, other beings like that. So I might think to myself that if a house is burning down and I can save either a human or an ant, but not both, then I can justifiably save the human, both because the human is more likely to matter and because the human is likely to matter more. And those are perfectly valid ways of breaking a tie. And that might give us some peace of mind when we countenance the possibility of including these very different, very numerous beings in the moral circle. But then you have to consider how large these populations actually are. And this is where we get to the problem that this paper addresses, which is a problem in population ethics.
Right, yes. And population ethics is the philosophical study of the kind of ethical problems that come up when our actions affect how many people are born in the future and who exactly is born. But yeah, my understanding is that we don't actually know how many of these small animals there are, ants and nematodes and maybe even microbes, I guess, but that it's at least plausible that there are so many of them that even if they have very less significant kinds of suffering and pleasure relative to humans, and even if we only put some small chance on them even having those at all, their interests still just swamp humans. And yeah, this argument just does sound plausible to me, and it also fills me with dread and fear. What is your experience of it?
Well, I certainly have the same experience as I think most humans do. And the reason I gave that paper the title, The Repugnant Conclusion, is that this is based on a famous book by the philosopher Derek Parfit called Reasons and Persons, part 4 of which addresses population ethics. And in that part of that book, Derek Parfit discusses what he calls the repugnant conclusion. And I can say briefly what that is and why that has, for the past several decades, filled many people with dread. So
yeah, please.
The repugnant conclusion results from the following observations. So if you could bring about one future where the world contained 100 people and everyone experienced 100,000 units of happiness, or you could bring about another world with twice the number of people, 200 people, but everyone experiences one fewer unit of happiness, 99,999, right? Which world is better? Well, many of us have the intuition that the second world is better. I should bring about that second population. I mean, everybody might experience, yes, 1 unit of happiness less per person, but since there are twice as many people, there is nearly twice as much happiness overall, and everyone is still really happy. And so, all things considered, I should bring about that population. But then you can imagine another population, once again, twice as big, once again, a bit less happiness per person, then another one, twice as big, a bit less happiness per person, and so on, and so on, and so on, until you reach a point where you are imagining a world or a solar system or a galaxy that contains a vast number of individuals, each of whom has a life only barely worth living at all. And your reasoning would commit you to the idea that that is the best possible world, the one that you should most want to bring about. Parfit thought the idea that we would favor that world with a much larger population where everyone has a life barely worth living at all over a world with a still significant population where everyone has lives very much worth living. He found that repugnant, and he spent much of the rest of his career trying and failing to find a better way to see the value of populations that could avoid that result.
I guess in the case of insects,
there's also this weird thing where, unlike humans eating potatoes and not particularly enjoying their kind of monotonous lives, we might think that being a spider and making a web sounds like pretty boring, but we actually just really do not know. And in many ways, they're so different from us that we should have much lower probability that they're not enjoying or enjoying that than we do of humans in this repugnant conclusion scenario. So how do you factor that in?
Yeah, I do share the intuition that a very large insect population is not better off in the aggregate than a much smaller human population or elephant population. But for some of the reasons that you just mentioned and other reasons, I am a little bit skeptical of that intuition. We have a lot of bias here, and we also have a lot of ignorance here, right? We have speciesism. We naturally prefer beings and relate to beings when they look like us, when they have large eyes and large heads and furry skin instead of scaly skin and 4 limbs instead of 6 or 8 limbs, and are roughly the same size as us instead of much smaller, and reproduce by having 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 children instead of thousands or more. So already we have a lot of bias in those ways. And we also have scope insensitivity. We tend not to be sensitive to the difference that very large numbers can make. And we have a lot of self-interest. We recognize that if we were to accept the moral significance of small animals like insects, and if we were to accept that larger populations can be better off than smaller populations overall, then we might face a future where these non-human populations carry a lot of weight and we carry less weight in comparison. And I think some of us find that idea so unthinkable that we search for ways to avoid thinking it. And we search for theoretical frameworks that would not have that implication. And it might be that we should take those theoretical frameworks seriously and consider avoiding that implication. But I at least want to be skeptical of a kind of knee-jerk impulse in that direction.
Yeah, I'm finding that very persuasive. I do see a lot of, even as you're saying it, I'm like trying to think my way out of describing what I'm experiencing as just a bunch of biases. And that in itself is like the biases in action. It's like me being like, no, I really, really, really want to confirm that people like me and me get to have, I don't know, it's not that we don't have priority. We obviously have some reason to consider ourselves a priority. Mm-hmm. But I want it to be like end of discussion. I want decisive reasons to give us like the top spot. And that instinct is so strong that in itself is making me a bit queasy about my own motivations.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I do think that we have some reason to prioritize ourselves, and we might talk about that later on. And that includes our welfare capacities and our knowledge about ourselves. It also includes more relational and pragmatic considerations. So we will, at least in the near term, I think, have fairly decisive reason to prioritize ourselves to some extent in some contexts. But yeah, I agree. I think that there is not a knockdown, decisive reason why humanity should always necessarily take priority over all other non-human populations. And that includes very large populations of very small non-humans like insects, or very small populations of very large non-humans. We could imagine some kind of super being that has a much more complex brain and much longer lifespan than us. And so we could find our moral significance and moral priority being questioned from both directions. And I think that it will be important to ask these questions with a lot of thought and care and to take our time in asking them. But I do start from the place of finding it implausible that it would miraculously be the case that this kind of population happens to be the best one, a moderately large population of moderately large beings like humans happens to be the magic recipe, and we matter more than all populations in either direction. That strikes me as implausible.
Bob Fischer on how to think about the moral weight of a chicken.
just to make sure I understand, the thing is saying that the capacity of welfare or suffering of a chicken in a given instant is about a third of the capacity for the kind of pain and pleasure a human could experience in a given instant. Is that it?
That's the way to think about it. And that might sound very counterintuitive.
It does.
I understand that. And I think there are a couple things we can say to help get us in the right frame of mind for thinking about these results. So one is, think about it first like a biologist. If you think that humans' pain is orders of magnitude worse than the pain of a chicken, you got to point to some feature of human brains that's going to explain why that would be the case. And I think for a lot of folks, they have a kind of simple picture where they say more neurons equals more compute equals, orders of magnitude difference in performance or something like that. And biologists are not going to think that way. They're going to say, well, look, neurons produce certain functions, and the number of neurons isn't necessarily that important to the function, and you might achieve the exact same function in using many more or many fewer neurons. And so that's just like not the really interesting, relevant thing. So that's the first step, is just to sort of try to think more like a biologist who's focused on functional capacities. So the second thing to say is just, you got to remember what hedonism says. So what's going on here is we're assuming that welfare is about just this one narrow thing, the intensities of pleasures and pains. You might not think that's true. You might think welfare is about, whether I know important facts about the world or whatever else, right? But that's not what I'm assessing, right? I'm just looking at this question of how intense is the pain. And you might also point out, quite rightly, but look, my cognitive life is richer. I have a more diverse range of negatively valent states. And I'm going to say, I don't care about the range. I care about the intensity, right? That's what hedonism says, is that what matters is how intense the pains are. So yeah, I'm very disappointed because, choose unhappy event of your preference. My favorite team lost, whatever the case may be, right? Uh-huh. And from the perspective of hedonism, what matters about that is just, well, how sad did it make me? Not the content of the experience, but just the amount of negatively valenced state that I'm experiencing, or rather the intensity of the negatively valenced state that I'm experiencing. So I think people often implicitly confuse variety in the range of valent states with intensity.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely something I do. I for sure there is a part of me that thinks that the thing that matters a lot here is that, like, I can fall in love in a particularly meaningful and big way. I can have friendships lasting 50 years that involve really deep and meaningful conversations, and that, like, even if a chicken has meaningful relationships with other chickens, like, they're not as complex and varied as the relationships I have with people in my life. On the other hand, a big part of me puts a bunch of weight when I, like, really, really think about it on just like, no, what matters is the intensity. If a chicken feels more sad about her wing being broken than I feel about losing a friend, then so be it. Like, we should, like, make sure that their wings aren't broken before we should make sure that whatever, insert threat that could mean I lose my friend. And I guess lots of listeners will have to have their own kind of internal turmoil about this, about welfare, even what welfare even is. But for now, I guess if we're just, like, taking this assumption, which is that, like, what matters is the intensity, your finding is that something like averting the suffering of, say, 3 chickens for an hour is similarly important to averting the suffering of 1 person for an hour. And that feels uncomfortable to me. Can you talk me through that discomfort?
Sure. So the first thing to say is, not alone. I don't feel totally comfortable either. And, we have to ask ourselves what our most serious moral commitments are when we're approaching this question. So we're not going to avoid really uncomfortable, challenging questions when we try to think about moral weights. Just not going to go away. But here are a few things to say. One is there any number that you wouldn't be uncomfortable with? Because notice that if you're committed to this idea of doing conversions, eventually it's going to just work out that you got to say there's some number of hours of chicken suffering that is more important than helping a human. And I think actually for a lot of people, they don't really think that there is any conversion at all, right? So if I had said it was 300, would you really have felt that much better? I mean, you might have felt a little bit better. I'm not saying you wouldn't felt it at all, sure, it's a difference. But you might still say, when you really think about 300 hours, like, would I put somebody through that for chickens? And then you might just have the same level of discomfort or something close to it. So I think to some degree, we have to remember that the trade-offs that we're talking about come from background theoretical commitments that have nothing to do with our specific welfare range estimates. It comes from the fact that we're trying to do the most good. We think that means making comparisons across species. And we're committed to this kind of maximizing ethic that says, yeah, there is some trade-off rate and you got to find it. So that's the first thing to say about the discomfort. Before I say anything else, like, what do you think about that?
Yes, some of that definitely worked for me. I think the thing that lands most is if I think about chickens on a railroad track and there's a trolley coming and there's a human on the other side, it is pretty impossible for me to imagine getting to the point where I'm ever super comfortable being like, I'm gonna let it hit the human who, like, I could have conversations with, who, like,
right, totally
has a family I might know, who, like, I could give a hug to, and, like, who has a job. Anyways, these are all the things that kind of run through my head as I'm, like, deciding whether to pull a lever to decide who gets hit by this trolley. And so fair enough that is something I have to grapple with regardless of exactly what these numbers are.
And I'll say, just to tag on to that, think about it when you put someone you really care about on the track. And so I think about this with my children and say, look, it might well be the case that there's almost no number of other humans I would choose to spare if given the choice between killing my own children and them. But that's not because I think they actually matter less in some objective sense. Like, when I'm trying to do the impartial good, I would never say, oh, yes, my children are utility monsters. They have infinite worth, and everybody else, has just some tiny portion of that. And so when we recognize that our moral judgments are so detached from our judgments of value, that also can help us think about why these welfare ranges might not be quite so crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there anything else that helps you with the discomfort?
Well, I think the thing that helps me to some degree is to say, look, we're doing our best here under moral uncertainty. I think you should update in the direction of animals based on this kind of work if you've never taken animals particularly seriously before. But ethics is hard. There are lots of big questions to ask. I don't know if hedonism is true. I mean, there are good arguments for it. There are good arguments for all the assumptions that go into the project. But yeah, I'm uncertain at every step. And so some kind of higher level caution about the entire venture is appropriate. And if you look at the way people actually allocate their dollars, they often do spread their bets in precisely this way. Even if they're really in on animals, they're still giving some money to AMF, and that makes sense because we want to make sure that we end up doing some good in the world. And that's a way of doing that.
Cool. Yeah, I guess I'm curious if there's anything you learned or like a narrative or story that you have that makes this feel more plausible to you. Like anything particular about chickens or just about philosophy. And you've already said some things, but what story do you have in your head that makes you feel comfortable being like, yes, I actually want to use these moral weights when deciding how to allocate resources?
So there are two things that I want to say about that. One is I really worry about my own deep biases. And part of the reason that I'm willing to be part of the EA project is because I think that at its best, its attempt to say, yeah, my gut's wrong. I shouldn't trust it. I should take the math more seriously. I should try to put numbers on things and calculate. And when I'm uncomfortable with the results, I'm typically the problem and not the process that I used. So that's one thing. It's a check on my own tendency to discount animals, even as someone who spends most of their life working on animals, right? So I think that's one piece. The other thing is just to spend time thinking about the kinds of things animals can do and what their lives are like. Just how hard a chicken will work to get to a nest box before she lays an egg. The amount of labor she's willing to go through to do that, to think about how important that is to her, and to realize that we can quantify that and see how much they care, or to see that they get stressed out when fellow chickens are threatened, and that they seem to have some sympathy, for conspecifics. Those kinds of things make me say there is something in there that is recognizable to me as another individual with desires and preferences and a vantage point on the world who wants things to go a certain way and is frustrated and upset when they don't. And recognizing the individuality, the perspective of non-human animals, for me really challenges my tendency to not take them as seriously as I think I ought to, all things considered.
Cameron Meyer Shorb on the range of suffering in wild animals.
Fundamentally, why do you worry about suffering among wild animals? I guess, what kinds of things make you think that they might be suffering a lot in particular?
So I'm wildly uncertain about what the nature of wild animals' lives are like, but I got into this field because I changed my mind about the possibilities here. I used to just assume that animals living in the wild were perfectly in balance and living totally fulfilled lives and weren't bothered by any of the stresses of modernity like I am, and that the best thing humans could possibly do for them is just leave them alone there. But the more I learned about it and thought about it, the more I realized that there's actually lots of reasons to think that wild animals might not be living great lives, at least many of them. So, for example, they often have to struggle to get enough food. They often need to struggle to protect themselves from extreme weather. There are some kinds of things where they have no protection at all, right? If a flood or a wildfire comes, that's just the end of it for them. There's also, all sorts of disease or parasites. They have no healthcare. They also have no state to protect them from violence, either from other species or even members of their own species. So the kinds of conditions we're talking about here, when humans live in those conditions, we would call that poverty, and we wouldn't tolerate that. We would say that those are problems we need to solve. Those are people who deserve better lives, and if we have medicine, we should help give them access to medicine. If there's ways to give them more stable access to food, that's something that would improve their lives. That's the kind of approach that I now think we should consider taking when we think about wild animals, is taking seriously the idea that they might be struggling even in their natural habitats, and they might suffer even from naturally occurring harms. And we should try to figure out to what extent that's true and if it's possible to do anything about that.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of those, because I feel like even though I'm a little bit familiar with this problem, I still have a super limited imagination for the kinds of things that animals, and obviously there's such a wide range across different species, but the kinds of things that wild animals might be going through, aside from like the really obvious one, being eaten or something. So putting a pin in that, what is the scale of the problem? How many individuals alive right now are wild animals?
The scale is huge. It's bigger than I can count. I've been humbled by learning about this, but I do think the scale is such an important part of understanding the problem. Just in the broadest possible strokes, based on the rough numbers we know, it looks like something like 99% of all sentient minds alive on Earth today are wild animals. And so if you are a human or a farmed animal, that is an incredibly rare exception to the rule, which is things that can feel live in the wild. More of a rounding error than anything, which is not to say that human and farmed animal experiences aren't important. It's just to say there is a lot more going on, and a truly impartial view of ethics would have us believe that ethics is mostly about wild animals, and also there are these interesting subfields related to some primates and farmed animals.
Okay. I'm interested in breaking down the numbers a bit more. I feel like it seems at least kind of important to know, are we mostly thinking about zebras, or are we mostly thinking about fish, ants? And what to think about feels like it could have at least helpful effects in helping me figure out, what are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask, because I think that the images that normally come to mind are not the most representative of wild animals. Most minds are wild, weird, and wet. They're just not humans or human-like things. So to try to get a sense of scale, I'll try to suggest a visualization. Let's imagine, for the sake of this exercise, that we're going to put a dot down of equal size for any individual that's alive. So 1 dot for a human, 1 dot for a squirrel, and you can debate later how you want to make trade-offs across species, but just for starters, to get a sense of the raw numbers. Now, let's make these dots small enough so that we can fit all 8.2 billion humans onto the face of a quarter or a euro, so something a little smaller than 1 square inch. If we're keeping that scale, then the 88 billion wild mammals would take up an area about the size of a credit card or a Post-it note. And then when we move on to birds, and I should say these estimates are all very rough, and the bigger the populations, the wider the error bars are. But for birds, let's say there are about 200 billion living in the wild. That would be something about the size of a standard envelope. And then for reptiles and amphibians, each of those numbers somewhere around 1 trillion individuals, so 2 trillion put together. And so a trillion would be a standard sheet of paper. So I think this is a good place to pause and just think about how far we've come from a quarter to an envelope, which is way bigger than a quarter, to a couple of sheets of paper, compared to a quarter that contains all of human experience and 8.2 billion lives. There's that times many, many more if you're trying to encompass humans and mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians. And then the numbers get even more mind-boggling when we move on to fish. There's something like 10 trillion fish in the world. So 10 trillion fish would be something like the size of a medium-sized desk. So the limnon from IKEA, if you will, or a large bath mat, or a couple of pillowcases, maybe. That's what the whole fish population would look like relative to the human population fitting on a quarter. And the numbers get really, I don't know what to boggle means literally, but I think it is something like what is happening to my mind. I think it is mind-boggling to try to imagine the number of plausibly sentient invertebrates. So the only at all close to useful number I've found here is an estimate of the number of terrestrial arthropods. So that would be animals with hard exoskeletons like insects and arachnids and crustaceans. So for those that live on land, estimates are that their population is somewhere around 100,000 trillion, which, if 8.2 billion humans fit on the face of a quarter. 100,000 trillion would need to be something the size of a city block or a FIFA regulation size soccer field. So imagine standing at any point in a soccer field and looking at a quarter and then looking around at the rest of the field. It really changes your perspective on what life on Earth is like, who's really living here. And it's hard to know whether many arthropods are sentient. I think there's like decent questions and considerations on either side. But one of the things that I think is important to consider there is just sort of the expected value. So even if there's just, say, a 10% chance that they are, 10% of a soccer field is still way bigger than a quarter.
Yeah, this makes me really happy that some of our most recent episodes, one is with Meghan Barrett, one of my favorite episodes of all time on invertebrate sentience. And really, I mean, it took me well above 10% probability or whatever credence that invertebrates are sentient. And another one is on fish with Sébastien Moro. And it's just infinite numbers of kind of bewildering facts about fish that, again, for me, the invertebrates and fish both make up tremendous numbers of individuals, as you've just said, and just are clearly, I mean, at least very, very plausible sentience candidates. For the case of fish, it seems hard to even debate for me. So given that these are the animals making up most of the wild nature we're talking about, anyone who's interested, I can recommend those episodes.
Sébastien Moro on whether fish are conscious or sentient.
This is fascinating and mind-blowing purely from the perspective of fish are incredibly cool. Do these feel like they tell you anything about whether fish are experiencing these things in some conscious way or affective way?
Okay, so as I said earlier, we have to split consciousness and sentience, which are not the same thing.
Yeah.
It's very hard, actually, talking about real consciousness, like high order consciousness, like human. We don't know how to assess it correctly, even in human. I mean, we don't have proper assessing tools. So today we're trying to build new ways to assess consciousness and sentience and split them properly. I think I understood that you've interviewed Jonathan Birch about that.
That's true.
He's a pioneer in it. He's a very, very important person on it. There is a very good book, especially on fish, a study, which is named What Is It Like to Be a Bass, Red Herring, Fish Pain, and the Study of Animal Sentience. It's a publication from 2022, and it's really interesting because it's coming back on all of this. And this is the famous study that we're talking about, the modification of the mirror test we were talking about. So many of the studies we've done, we've talked about, they aren't made to assess sentience.
From your perspective, you know so much of what there is to know about fish that we have studied so far. So you've got all of this kind of wealth of knowledge. What is it that feels most compelling to you, that makes you feel like you've got, really, really high confidence that fish are experiencing things?
That most of the papers we have are going in this way, and very few, very, very few are going the other way. So what makes me so certain, and I'm not talking about, I'm really talking about my personal opinion there.
Of course.
I tend to think that emotions, what are emotions? What are emotions used for? They are putting a gloss on what is around us. This stuff has a positive gloss. I need more of this. This one has a negative gloss. And we know that emotions are very, very closely linked to learning. So emotions are something that attract or repel. And it seems pretty obvious that it must have appeared very, very, very early in evolution, because this is how we work. And this is maybe one of the biggest difference with algorithm of following closed loops. And this comes up when animals are more driven by emotions, by value of things, which is made by a kind of limbic system that says, okay, this is good, this is bad, you want more of this, you want less of that. And I don't understand why other animals wouldn't have that. And another thing is I'm reading a lot about bees, so I know very well the corpus of knowledge on bees at the moment, and we're starting to have the same results in bees. So I'm not 100% certain now bees could be sentient, but the biggest leader of bees research today, Lars Chitka, has said on Twitter that bees are sentient for him. And the results we have are going in this way. So they have a 1 million neurons brain, and the brain of fish are much, much, much bigger. And it's not even, when we split from insects, brains were not existing either. So it's just a convergent evolution.
Yeah.
So yeah, fish have complicated lives. They have social lives, very social lives. I already introduced this with cleaner wrasse. Their lives are very complicated. They have challenges that they have to overcome that are as complex as what we find in mammals and birds, maybe more sometimes. So them having no sentience, when we recognize sentience in birds and mammals, it's either you refuse it for everyone, either you accept it for everyone at the moment. Not for everyone, because animals with a brain or central nervous system today, we think at least there should be a kind of global network. Everything should be put in common to make a unified vision of you and this kind of thing. But consciousness probably have many degrees. Sentience have pretty much many degrees, but not degrees on a ladder, degrees more on a circle. You know? But that would sound just weird, actually, that they wouldn't be sentient.
Yeah. Just be really surprising to you.
David Chalmers on when to start worrying about artificial consciousness.
So you said elsewhere that if more fully autonomous artificial intelligence comes around, then we might have to start worrying about it being conscious and therefore presumably worthy of moral concern. But you don't think we have to worry about it too much before then. So I'm just wondering if you can say a bit about why and whether you think it's possible that programs or computers could become gradually more and more conscious and whether that process might start before they are fully autonomous.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. And I guess one would expect to get conscious AI well before we get to human level artificial general intelligence, simply because we've got pretty good reason to believe there are many conscious creatures that whose degree of intelligence falls well short of human level artificial general intelligence. So if fish are conscious, for example, and you might think if an AI gets to sophistication and information processing and whatever the relevant factors are to the degree present in fish, then that should be enough. And it does open up the question as to whether any existing AI systems may actually be conscious. And, I think the consensus view is that they're not, but the more liberal you are about descriptions of consciousness, the more we should take seriously the chance that they are. I mean, there is this website out there called People for the Ethical Treatment of Reinforcement Learners that I quite like. The idea is that every time you give a reinforcement learning network its reward signal, then it may be experiencing pleasure or correspondingly suffering, depending on the valence of the signal. And as someone who's committed to taking panpsychism seriously, I think I should at least take that possibility seriously. So I don't know where current deep learning networks fall on the scale of organic intelligence. Maybe they're at least as sophisticated as worms like C. elegans with 300 neurons. I take seriously the possibility that those are conscious. So I guess I do take seriously the possibility that AI consciousness could come along well before human level AGI and that it may exist already. Then the question, though, is, I suppose, how sophisticated the state of consciousness is it? If it's about as sophisticated as, say, the consciousness of a worm, I think most of us are inclined to think, okay, well, then that brings along, say, some moral status with it, but it doesn't give it enormous weight in the scheme of conscious creatures compared to the weight we give humans and mammals and so on. So I guess then the question would be whether current AIs get a truly sophisticated moral status, but I guess I should be open to them at least getting some relatively small moral status of the kind that, say, worms have.
So maybe this is getting outside your area of expertise, but with like current ML systems, how would we have any sense of whether the affected states are positive or negative? And it seems like, yeah, and as much as you like have a reinforcement learner, I guess on average, does it get like zero reinforcement because it just has kind of an equal balance of like positive and negative reinforcements? And is there some way that you could just like scale all of them up to be like more or less positive? Or does that even mean anything? Like you just increase all the numbers by 100 and then like, how would that help? It kind of raises this issue of the arbitrariness of kind of the 0 point on this kind of scale of goodness of the states.
Yeah, well, this is getting to issues about value and morality that do go beyond my expertise to some extent. And no, we've got absolutely no way right now to tell exactly what reinforcement learning systems might be experiencing, if anything. But if you were inclined to think they're experiencing something and that they're experiencing something with valence, I suppose then they'd be having a mix of positively valenced reinforcement and negatively valenced reinforcement, therefore a mix of some very simple precursor of, say, of pleasure and of suffering, proto-pleasure and proto-suffering. Then a lot's going to depend on your ethical theory. If you're feeling pleasure half the time, but suffering half the time, is that net good? Is that net bad? I don't know. If you ask me, I think that's net bad because, all that suffering tends to outweigh the pleasure, but maybe there's weights on the scale. At this point, though, I should say that it's by no means obvious to me that pleasure and suffering, that is, that valence states of consciousness are the ones that are relevant to moral status. I know people quite often have this view. I'm inclined to think that consciousness may ground moral status in some cases quite independently of its valence. And even beings with unvalent states of consciousness could still have moral status.
Robert Long on how we might stumble into causing AI systems enormous suffering.
So you can imagine that a robot has been created by a company or by some researchers, and as it happens, it registers damage to its body and processes it in the way that, as it turns out, is relevant to like having an experience of unpleasant pain. And maybe we don't realize that because we don't have good theories of what's going on in the robot or what it takes to feel pain. In that case, you can imagine that thing having a bad time because we don't realize it.
Right.
You could also imagine this thing being like rolled out, and now we're economically dependent on systems like this. And now we have an incentive not to care and not to think too hard about whether it might be having a bad time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that seems like something that could happen.
Yeah. And that could happen because, I mean, there's some reason why it's helpful to have the robot recognize that it's sustained damage. It can be like, help, I'm broken. I need someone to fix my part. So that's like something that you can imagine, like might get programmed in. And then like, it is just kind of wild to me that like we don't understand what the robot might be experiencing well enough to know like that thing is pain. But like in theory, that's possible. Just like it's kind of that black boxy to us.
Yeah, so it might be a little bit less likely with a robot.
Yeah.
But now you can imagine more abstract or alien ways of feeling bad. So I focus on pain because it's like a very straightforward way of feeling bad.
Yeah.
A disembodied system like GPT-3, which we'll talk about, obviously can't feel ankle pain, or almost certainly, like that would be really weird. Doesn't have an ankle.
Right,
Why would it have computations that like represent its ankle as feeling bad?
Mm-hmm.
But you can imagine maybe some strange form of valenced experience that develops inside some system like this that registers some kind of displeasure or pleasure, something like that.
Right. Something like,
and that
you
could be a lot
guessed
harder.
the wrong set of words to come next, and that was bad. And the user isn't happy with the like string of words you came up with, and then that feels something like pain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I will note that I don't think that getting negative feedback is going to be enough for like that bad feeling, fortunately.
Yeah.
But maybe some combination of that and some way it's ended up representing it inside itself ends up like that.
Okay.
And then we have something where it's hard for us to map its internals to what we care about. We maybe have various incentives not to look too hard at that question. We have incentives not to let it speak freely about if it thinks it's conscious, because like that would be a big headache.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're also worried about systems lying about being conscious and giving misleading statements about whether they're conscious, which they definitely do. Yeah, so we've built this new kind of alien mind. We don't really have a good theory of pain, even for ourselves. We don't have a good theory of what's going on inside it. And so that's like a that's sort of like a stumbling into this sort of scenario.
Yeah. But it sounds like there's also just like, we like make things for like economic reasons, like robots or like chatbots, and we don't realize those things are suffering. And then we like mass produce them because they're valuable, and like those things are suffering and we didn't know it, and they're like all over, and we don't really want to change anything about those systems because we use them.
Yeah, I mean, for just another dark scenario, you can imagine a system where we get pigs to be farmed much more efficiently, and we're just like, well, this has made meat cheaper. Let's not think too much about that.
Totally.
Yeah. I guess one thing I should note is I've been focusing on this like case where we've hit on it accidentally. There are a lot of people who are interested in building artificial consciousness.
Mm-hmm. On purpose.
And
yeah.
understandably so.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like just from a purely intellectual or philosophical standpoint, it's a fascinating project. And it can help us understand the nature of consciousness. So for a very long time, probably about as old as AI, people were like, wow, I wonder if we could make this thing conscious.
Right.
So there was a recent New York Times article, about roboticists who, want to build more self-awareness into robots, both for the intrinsic scientific interest and also because it might make for better robots.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them think, oh, well, like we're not actually that close to doing that. And maybe that, it's too soon to worry about it. Another person quoted in that article is like, yeah, it's something to worry about, but like we'll deal with it. And I am quoted in that piece as just kind of being like, be careful, like slow down. Right. We're not really ready to deal with
to
this.
Quote unquote deal with that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Jonathan Birch on how we might accidentally create artificial sentience.
You did raise a few interesting points about AI sentience that I wanted to ask more about. So one is that you emphasize that AI sentience could arise in a number of ways. I think I intuitively imagine it either arising intentionally or unintentionally as a result of work on LLMs. But one of these other ways is whole brain emulation. And one case I hadn't heard that much about is OpenWorm. Can you talk a bit more about the goals of OpenWorm and how the project has gone?
This was a project that caught my eye around 2014, I think, because the goal was to emulate the entire nervous system of the nematode worm, C. elegans. And this is a worm for which we've had the entire connectome, so all the connections between neurons, mapped out since the 80s. There's fewer than 400 of them. And so the goal was to emulate this system in its entirety in software. And they had some striking initial results where they put their emulation in charge of a robot, and the robot did some kind of worm-like things in terms of navigating the environment, turning round when it hit an obstacle, that kind of thing. And it generated some initial hype.
It feels naive now, but it was eye-opening to me when you pointed out that we actually just wouldn't need whole brain emulation in humans or of human brains to start thinking about the risks from AI sentience. We just need to go from OpenWorm to open zebrafish or open mouse or maybe even open Drosophila, which sounds like not an insane step from just where we are now. How likely is it, do you think, that researchers would try to create something like open mouse?
Oh, it's very likely. Yeah, if they knew how, of course they would. I think one of the main themes of that part of the book is once we see the decoupling of sentience and intelligence, which is very important to think of these as distinct ideas, we realize that artificial sentience might not be the sort of thing that goes along with the most intelligent systems. It might actually be more likely to be created by attempts to emulate the brain of an insect, for example, where the intelligence would not be outperforming ChatGPT on any benchmarks, but perhaps more of the relevant brain dynamics might be recreated.
Yeah, it was a jarring observation for me because I just had, I think part of it is that it hadn't occurred to me that people would be as motivated as they are to create something like Open Mouse. Can you say more about
what the motivation is? Does it have scientific value beyond being cool, or is the fact that it's just cool, a cool thing to do, enough?
I think it would have an immense scientific value. It would appear to be a long way in the future still, as things stand. But of course, we're talking here about understanding the brain. I think when you emulate the functions of the C. elegans nervous system, you can really say you understand what is going on.
Right.
And that just isn't true for human brains currently. We have no idea at quite a fundamental level. Our understanding of C. elegans is in some ways far better. And that it's another step again if you don't just understand how lesioning bits of the nervous system affects function, but you can also recreate the whole system in computer software, would be a tremendous step. And it holds the promise over the long term of giving us a way to replace animal research, because once you've got a functioning emulation of a brain, you can step past that very crude method of just taking the living brain and injuring it, which is what a lot of research involves, or modifying it through genome editing. And you can instead go straight to the system itself and do incredibly precise manipulations. So I feel like if anything, it hasn't been hyped enough. I want more of this kind of thing, to be honest, than has been the case so far.
Intuitively, it seems plausible and maybe even likely that if you were able to emulate a mind that we thought was sentient, that the emulation would also be sentient. But is there a reason to think those come apart? Maybe we just don't know.
It's another space where you get reasonable disagreement, because I think we have to take seriously the view that philosophers call computational functionalism, a view on which if you recreate the computations, you also recreate the subjective experience. And that leads to further questions about at what grain does one have to recreate the computations? Is it enough to recreate the general type of computation, or does every algorithm at every level, including the within neuron level, have to be recreated? And there too, there's disagreement. And I think we have to take seriously the possibility that recreating the general types of computations might be enough. And I call this view large-scale computational functionalism, that it might be a matter of simply creating a global workspace or something like that, even if the details are quite different from how the global workspace is implemented in the human brain. And if we take that view seriously, as we should, it really does suggest a kind of parity. I wouldn't want to overstate it, because I'd say that the probability of sentience is higher in the biological system than in its software emulation. But still, that software emulation is potentially a candidate.
Anil Seth, on which parts of the brain are required for consciousness?
I'm really, really curious to get your thoughts on animals.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe I would like to start with different kind of neuroscientific theories of consciousness. Which parts of the brain are sufficient and required for consciousness? Feels like it might be a really key question for thinking about which non-human animals we should expect to have conscious experiences, because some non-human animals, like insects, only have things that look much more like the kind of very old parts of the human brain, the parts that are deeper in. Do you have a view on which theories seem most plausible to you? Are the kind of really old parts of the brain, the subcortical parts, sufficient for consciousness?
To be honest, I don't know. But I'm just, I think, to help orient in this really critical discussion, critical because, of course, it has massive implications for animal welfare and how we organize society and so on. It's worth taking a quick step back again and just comparing the problem of animal consciousness with the one of AI consciousness, because in both cases, there's uncertainty, but there are very different kinds of uncertainty.
Almost opposite ones.
Almost exactly opposite. In AI, we have this uncertainty that does the stuff matter. AI is fundamentally made out of something different. Animals are fundamentally the same because we are also animals. And then there's the things that are are different. So animals generally do not speak to us and often fail when measured against our highly questionable standards of human intelligence. Whereas AI systems now speak to us and measured against these highly questionable criteria are doing increasingly well. So I think we have to understand how our psychological biases are playing into this. It could well be that AI is more similar to us in ways that do not matter for consciousness and less similar in ways that do. And non-human animals the other way around. We've got a horrible track record of withholding conscious status and therefore moral considerability from other animals, but even from other humans. For some groups of humans, we just do this. We've historically done this all the time and are still doing it now. So there's this principle in kind of ethics called the precautionary principle, that when we're uncertain, we should basically err on the side of caution given the consequences. So I think this is really worth bearing in mind for non-human animals. You could apply the same to AI and say, well, we should just apply that. Since there's uncertainty, we should just assume AI is conscious. I think no. I think the effect of bias is so strong, and we can't care for everything as if it's conscious, because we only have a certain amount of care to go around. But when it comes to non-human animals, they have the brain regions, the brain processes that seem highly analogous to the ones in human and mammalian brains for emotional experiences, pain, suffering, pleasure, and so on, that I think it pays to extend the precautionary principle more in that direction. Figuring out exactly which animals are conscious and that's, of course, we don't know. But there are things that I think are relatively clear. So mammals, if we just take mammals very broadly from a mouse to a chimpanzee to a human, we find very similar brain structures and similar sorts of behaviors and things like that. So it seems very, very, very unlikely that there are some mammals that lack consciousness. I think mammals are conscious. But even then, we've had to get rid of some of the things that historically you might have thought of as essential for consciousness, like higher order reasoning and language. I mean, Descartes was infamous, but at the time, it was probably a very sensible move because of the pressure he was under from the religious authorities. He was very clear that only humans had consciousness, or the kind of consciousness that mattered. And that was because we had these rational minds. So he associated consciousness with these higher rational functions. And now people generally don't do that. So mammals are within the magic circle. What else? Then it becomes really hard because we have to just walk this line. We have to recognize we're using humans and then by extension mammals as a kind of benchmark. But, there might well be other ways of being conscious. What about the octopus, as Peter Godfrey-Smith has written beautifully about? What about a bumblebee? What about a bacteria? It's almost impossible to say. It seems intuitive to me that some degree of neural complexity is important, but I recognize I don't want to fall into the trap of using something like intelligence as a benchmark.
Yeah, so I mean, that's just basically what I find both maddening and fascinating about this question of non-human animals. It feels like there's this very frustrating slippery slope thing where I don't want to be overly biased toward humans or toward structures that kind of create consciousness, whatever that means, in the way that ours does. And it does seem like there might be multiple ways to do it. And over time, I've become much, much, much more sympathetic to the idea that not just birds and not just cephalopods, but insects have some kinds of experiences. And I just find it really confusing about kind of where and how and whether it makes sense to draw a line, or maybe that's just philosophically nonsensical. And so I'm really drawn to this question, which is why I opened with it, of can neuroscience point to functions or places or parts of the brain that seem related enough to consciousness that, like, if we see analogous things in bees, we should update a lot on that. But I also kind of have the impression that that there's still so much debate about kind of subcortical and cortical theories, and which is more plausible, that maybe we're just not there, and that's not possible now and might not be for a while.
I mean, Jonathan Birch, who's a philosopher at UCL, has this beautiful new book called The Edges of Sentience, which I think is all about this. It's trying to figure out how far we can generalize and on what basis. I think the issue is that it seems very sensible that there would be other, that consciousness is multiply realizable to an extent, that different kinds of brains could generate different kinds of experience, but it'd still be experience. But to know when that's the case, we have to understand the sort of the basis of consciousness in a way that goes beyond it requires this or that region. We need to know, okay, so what is it that these brain areas are doing or being that makes them important for consciousness, in a way that we could say, well, we obviously don't see a frontal cortex in a honeybee because they don't have that kind of brain, but they're doing something, or their brains are made of the stuff and organized in the right way that's we can have some credence that's enough for consciousness. And we don't really have that yet. I mean, so the theories of consciousness that exist are varied. So some of them are pretty explicitly theories about human consciousness, and they're harder to extrapolate to non-human animals. Like, what would be a global workspace in a fruit fly?
Right.
You could make some guesses, but there would be pretty. The theory as it is more assuming there's a kind of cortical architecture like a human. And other theories like integrated information theory are much clearer. Like, okay, wherever there is some non-zero integrated information, maxima of, there's consciousness, but just impossible to actually measure that in practice. So very, very hard. But the path, I think, is clear, that the more that the better that we can understand consciousness where we are sure that it exists, the surer our footing will be elsewhere where we're less confident, because we will be able to generalize better. So where are your areas of uncertainty? I'm always interested. Like, just for you, where do you I'm not sure?
Yeah, mine. So I feel like I've just, through getting to learn about these topics for this show, I constantly get told these amazing facts about fish and bees and the kinds of learning they can do and the kinds of motivational trade-offs they make, and the fact that they do nociception, and that nociception gets integrated into other parts of their behavior. And that all feels really compelling to me. And then I talk to someone who's like, yeah, but a lot of that could just be happening unconsciously. And at what point it's more plausible that they're little robots doing things unconsciously, and then when it becomes and then at what point it becomes more plausible that a little robot doing that is just a less likely story than it's got the lights switched on in some way and it's making trade-offs because the world is complicated and it's evolved to have more complex systems going on so that it can survive. I just find that really, really confusing.
I think, I think me too. But I think actually there's a point you make which I didn't make, and so I'm grateful for you bringing that up, which is the functional point of view too. So instead of just asking like which brain regions or interactions between brain regions do we see, we can ask from the point of view of function and evolution, which is usually the best way to make sense of things comparatively between animals and biology. So what is the function of consciousness? And if we can understand more about that, then we can have another criterion for saying, okay, so which other animals do we see facing and addressing those same kinds of functions? And of course, there may be other functions. We have to be sensitive of that too, but at least it's another productive line. And in humans and mammals, there's no single answer, but it seems as though consciousness gets into the picture when we need to bring together a lot of different kinds of information signals from the environment in a way that is very much centered on the possibilities for flexible action, all kind of calibrated in the service of homeostasis and survival. So, automatic actions, reflexive actions don't seem to involve consciousness. Flexibility, kind of informational richness, and sort of goal-directedness. Those seem to be functional clues. So the extent we see animals implementing those similar functions, I think that's quite good reason for attributing consciousness, but it's not 100%.
Yeah. That's basically where I am. And it means that I now feel a lot of feelings about the bees in my garden. And mostly I feel really grateful to have learned about these topics, but I also feel really overwhelmed.
Peter Godfrey-Smith on uploads of ourselves.
Why are you doubtful that we could create uploads of ourselves?
My view on that comes from the general position that I'm developing slowly, cautiously on the biology of conscious experience, or the biology of felt experience. And this was developed in a bit more detail in the second book, but it has a discussion in Living on Earth as well. The view that I think is most justified, the view I would at least put money on, is a view in which some of what it takes to be a system with felt experience involves relatively schematic functional properties, the way that a system is organized in relation to sensing and action and memory and the internal processing and so on. And some of those, what are often referred to as functional properties, could exist in a variety of different physical realizations, in different hardwares or different physical bases. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think nervous systems are special. I think that the way that nervous systems work, the way that our brains work, there are sort of two kinds of properties that nervous systems have. There's a collection of point-to-point network interactions where this cell makes that cell fire and prevents that cell from firing, the spiking of neurons and the great point-to-point massive network interactions. And there's also other stuff which for years was somewhat neglected, I think, in these discussions, but which I think is probably very important. There are more diffuse, large-scale dynamic properties that exist within nervous systems, oscillatory patterns of different speeds, subtle forms of synchronization that span the whole or much of the brain. And these are the sorts of things picked up in an EEG machine, that kind of large-scale electrical interaction. And I didn't come up with this myself. There's a tradition, Francis Crick thought this, neuroscientists like Wolf Singer, a number of other people who've argued that this side of the brain is important to the biology of conscious experience, along with the sort of networky, more computational side of the brain, that both sets of properties of nervous systems are important. And in particular, the unity of experience, the way in which brain activity generates a unified point of view on the world, has a dependence upon the oscillatory and other large-scale dynamic patterns that you get in brains. Now, if you look at computer systems, you can program a computer to have a moderately decent facsimile of the network properties in a brain. But the large-scale dynamic patterns, the oscillatory patterns that span the whole, they're a totally different matter. I mean, you could write a program that includes a kind of rough simulation where you'd know what was happening if the physical system in fact had large-scale dynamic patterns of the relevant kind. But that's different from having in a physical system those activities actually going on, present physically rather than just being represented in a computer program. I do think there's a real difference between those generally, and especially in the case of these brain oscillations and the like. You would have to build a computer where the hardware had a brain-like pattern of activities and tendencies. And this is not part of, I mean, people might one day do that, but it's not part of what people normally discuss in debates about artificial consciousness, uploading ourselves to the cloud and so on.
Right.
People assume that you could take a computer like the ones you and I are using now with the same kind of hardware, and if you just got the program right, if it was a big, powerful one and you programmed it just right, it could run through not just a kind of representation of what a brain does, but a kind of realization and another instance or another form of that brain activity. Now, because I think the biology of consciousness is just not like that, I think that the second set of features of brains really matter. I think that it will be much harder than people normally suppose to build any kind of artificial sentient system that has no living parts. It's not that I think there's a kind of absolute barrier from the materials themselves.
Right.
I don't know if there is, but I certainly think it would have to be much, much more brain-like. The computer hardware would have to be a lot more brain-like than it is now. And that means, I mean, who knows if we could build large numbers of these, powered with a big solar array and replicate our minds in them. I think it's very unlikely, I must say. Now, whether that's unlikely or not, I don't think I should be confident about. The thing I am a bit confident about, or fairly confident about, is the idea that there's lots of what happens in brains that's probably important to conscious experience, which is just being ignored in discussions of uploading our minds to the cloud and things like that.
Yeah. That's really helpful. So I don't know very much about these kind of large scale dynamics. Are they a result of neuronal firings, or are they a result of other things going on in the brain?
This is quite a controversial point, actually. I mean, it's a good question. The sense I have, and I'm continually trying to learn the latest on this, is that most of the activity in those large-scale dynamic patterns is not just a summing together of lots of firing of neurons. Because if it was, then you might say, well, then the network point-to-point, cell-to-cell things really are all that matters once you've really captured those, and the other stuff is just a consequence or a kind of zoomed out manifestation of that. And I don't think that does not seem to be the case. It seems rather that within the cells that make up our brain, there's a kind of to and fro of ions across membranes that is below the threshold that is required to actually make the neuron fire, that sort of dramatic spark-like firing. It's more of a kind of rhythmic, lower-level, sub-threshold electrical oscillation. And those oscillations affect the firing of neurons, and the firing of neurons affect the oscillations. But there is a kind of duality of processes there. And it's not just that if you knew which cells were firing when and you ignored everything else, that you could recapture, in a sense, the large-scale dynamic patterns. There's more than that.
Right. So if you take this kind of, what for me has been a very intuitive, but I guess would feel like an inadequate thought experiment of replacing each neuron in the human brain one by one with an artificial silicon-based one. It sounds like you would guess that doing that, even if you got that to work, it wouldn't make kind of the entire process and kind of physical system of the brain be entirely artificial. Like there would be other things that remained biological that were playing a crucial role that you hadn't replaced and replicated yet.
Well, the way you described it, you made it sound like at the end of this process, the biological parts were gone. So is it that we really replace everything, or it's just we replace some stuff and leave some of the biological material in place?
Yeah, I think I'm curious about whether you just replaced neurons with synthetic neurons. Do you think there would be a working brain at the end? And if so, would that be because the other biological stuff was still there?
Okay, right, I see. It's a commitment of my view that if you tried to do that, you would change all sorts of stuff. You can't really preserve the things that the brain is doing at the start and have them continue once the neurons have been replaced by artificial devices. When I say that, what are the artificial devices? When people talk about thought experiments of this kind, which they've done, I think, in quite interesting ways for about 40 years now, what they usually imagine is you're replacing each neuron with a kind of relay object that sums up the inputs coming in and either fires or doesn't fire, and its firing then contributes to the inputs to various other downstream cells. And it's just doing that. It's not doing anything else. Now, if the things you put into the brain were just doing that, then you would give up, essentially. You would drop all those large-scale dynamic patterns. They just wouldn't exist anymore. They would be gone.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it would be a different thing physically. It would do different things because the relationship between the firing of neurons and those slower oscillations does make a difference to how the brain works. So you would change some stuff that would have consequences. Now, something that people haven't talked about so much is whether you could put in an artificial object that did really everything that the neuron is doing, where there's this sort of seepage of ions across the borders, and it has subtle effects on the electrical properties of neighboring cells and so on. I mean, a replacement that captured a lot more of what a neuron did. And then we reached the point where we got to a few minutes ago where I said, well, who knows what artificial hardwares might be possible. I don't think I know nearly enough about these matters to be confident you could never build something that did that.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand your position on this, it's not that you're confident that it's impossible to create digital minds in general, or that it's impossible to eventually come up with some hardware system that does replicate everything relevant to consciousness in a human, but that the current kind of thought experiments where we only replicate some of the basic functions of a neuron are not enough. Yeah, is that basically your view? Have I gotten that right?
There was a phrase you used, digital minds, and I guess I don't think there'll ever be digital minds. I think that's imagining a system which lacks too much of what brains and nervous systems are like in order for it to have a mind. I don't know if there might be wholly artificial minds in the future that are made of different stuff than brains are made of, but that have the important duality of properties that you see in nervous systems, and that thereby achieve a kind of sentience. I think it's further away than people often suppose, but I would not want to say it could never happen. The thing I want to press on in a kind of critical way is the habits that people have of thinking. People think, well, I know what neurons and nervous systems do. It's like a telephone exchange. You've got this thing that makes that thing go, and it's like a big network, and that's all there is to it. They think that, and then they think, well, a computer is a place where I can have that kind of thing going on, replicated to a high degree of fidelity. So I know that an ordinary computer has what it takes as hardware to be sentient, basically, to be conscious if I put the right program in there, because the program would just have to create a version of those networked point-to-point interactions. Now, that claim I do want to push back against. I don't think we have any reason to believe that. And I think that artificial sentience is just going to be a harder and further in the future thing than we have supposed. And as I say at one point in this book, Living on Earth, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. If there turns out to be kind of a barrier between the I side of AI, the intelligent side of AI, and the kind of conscious, sentient, feeling side of artificial minds. If there's a barrier there, that might not be a bad thing. One reason for that is if we start building lots of sentient systems that have this different kind of hardware, they're under our control. We made them. I don't know how likely it is that their experiences are going to be positive,
Right.
at least in the early stages. It's going to be a sort of a klutzy, messed up version of artificial sentience that we're working with. And if I'm a disembodied spirit of the kind that you were talking about earlier, I don't want to come down to earth and live as an early effort in the human attempt to make artificial sentient systems.
Jonathan Birch on treading lightly around the edge cases of sentience.
So a big part of the book then explores these candidates for sentience. So beings that we think could plausibly be sentient, but because we just know so little about exactly what sentience even is and how different beings feel it in what proportions, there's not enough kind of clear understanding or evidence to be sure what it is like to be them. You look at some familiar candidates, including animals of different classes, as well as AI. And then you also look at some cases that I was really unfamiliar with, including people with disorders of consciousness, so people in comas, for example, and then also neural organoids, which I'd never heard of. So to start us off, what exactly is a neural organoid?
This is another very fast-moving area of emerging technology. Basically, it uses human stem cells that are induced to form neural tissue, and the aim is to produce a 3D model of some brain region, or in some cases, a whole developing brain.
And what's the case for creating them?
I think it's a very exciting area of research. You can make organoids for any organ, really. And in a way, it's a potential replacement for animal research. If you ask what we do now, usually people research on whole animals, which are undeniably sentient. And here we have a potential way to gain insight into the human version of the organ. It could be a better model, and it's much, much less likely to be sentient if it's something like a kidney organoid or a stomach organoid. It's really only when we're looking at the case of the brain and neural organoids that the possibility of sentience starts to re-emerge.
Yeah, and intuitively, the case for sentience does feel like it immediately lands for me. If you are trying to make an organoid that is enough like a brain that we can learn about brains, it doesn't seem totally outrageous that it would be a sentience candidate. What is the evidence that we have so far?
It's a complicated picture. I think there are reasons to be quite skeptical about organoids as they are now, but the technology is moving so fast. There's always a risk of being ambushed by some new development. At present, it really doesn't seem like there's clear sleep-wake cycles. It doesn't seem like those brainstem structures or midbrain structures that regulate sleep-wake cycles and that are so important on the Merker-Panksepp view are in place. But there are reasons to be worried. For me, the main reason to be worried was a study from 2019 that allowed organoids to grow for about a year, I think, and compared them to the brains of preterm infants using EEG. So what they did was that they used EEG data from the preterm infants to train a model, and then they used that model to try and guess the age of the organoid from its EEG data, and the model performed better than chance.
Wow.
So it's hard to interpret this kind of study because some people, I suppose, read it superficially as saying these organoids are like the brains of preterm infants. And that's an exaggeration because, they're very, very different. and much, much smaller. But still, there's enough resemblance in the EEG to allow estimates of the age that are better than chance.
It's definitely something. I find it unsettling, for sure.
It is, yeah. I think a lot of people had that reaction as well. And I think that's why we're now seeing quite a lively debate in bioethics about how to regulate this emerging area of research. It's currently pretty unregulated. And it raises this worrying prospect of scientists taking things too far.
Right.
Where they will often say, well, these systems are only 1 million neurons. We want to go up to 10 million, but that's so tiny compared to a human brain. And it is tiny compared to a human brain. But if you compare it to the number of neurons in a bee brain, for example, that's about 1 million. So these near future organoids will be about the size of 10 bee brains in terms of neuron count. And I think bees are sentience candidates. So naturally, I take this risk quite seriously, and I think it would be wrong to dismiss it.
Meghan Barrett on whether brain size and sentience are related.
I guess the thing I do care about in the context of this, sentience discussion is brain size. It feels like brain size is at least more likely to be tracking the thing that I care about. Mm-hmm. And I guess I care about whether these very large insects also have very large brains, or if the beetle is mostly like other guts as opposed to brain guts.
This is a phenomenal question. I appreciate you asking it very much, and it's very interesting to me. So I have a couple of points to make on the brain size piece of this. I guess the first thing I'll say is just that we should ask ourselves if more actually always means better or more sophisticated. So that's an assumption to challenge about our thinking about brains. So for example, elephants have more neurons and more brain mass than you and I do, and yet I don't consider them more likely to be sentient than me. Same thing with blue whales. And that's because we know a lot of those additional neurons are because they're just bigger. And so they have more mass to control, right? They have more touch points they need to be able to integrate and things like that. So more doesn't always mean more sophisticated. It can often just mean more of the same repeat unit, right? That performs the same kind of function. And that explains very plausibly, I think, this phenomenon that we see where very small brains are capable of producing really complex abilities. Insects are capable of things like numerical cognition, social learning, facial recognition, cognitive bias, and much more. And so because of this behavioral data and this complexity that, we initially thought was just going to be something you find in vertebrates, and now we're seeing it in invertebrates with pretty small brains like honeybees, this suggests that maybe those bigger brains aren't actually better or more sophisticated. They just have more redundancies or repeating modules. And you could think of this as changing resolution or complexity of a capacity without changing the existence of that capacity itself, right? So imagine an image that has more pixels to it. It doesn't change the fact that there's still a picture, right? It just changes the resolution of that picture. So that's part one to this, is that first we should just challenge that basic assumption that bigger brains are necessarily better at producing a capacity at all. The next thing we need to think about is whether or not they're actually that small, right? Which is sort of what you were asking initially. So here again, I want to give some examples from vertebrates and invertebrates to challenge our intuition that vertebrates are always bigger than invertebrates. So let's first consider just the mammals, because I think we all feel really comfortable talking about mammal sentience. So the smallest mammal brain that we have studied so far weighs in at 64.4 milligrams. That's the Etruscan shrew.
That is tiny.
So shrews can get very small, very, very small. And the body mass of that shrew is about 2 grams or so, give or take. So we get some pretty small mammals out there. When we look at the largest insect brain we've studied to date, it's a solitary wasp, and it weighs in at 11.7 milligrams. So that's an insect with a body mass of about 0.5 grams, so a quarter the size of the shrew.
Yeah.
That makes that shrew's brain just 6 times about larger than the insect brain. That's a smaller difference than we see between humans and whales. So already, even if we're just considering the mammals, we see, relatively comparable brain masses. Now, that's just one level of looking at the brain. I want to also extend beyond just mammals now and consider other vertebrates you might take seriously, like your lizards, per se. So our smallest lizard brain that we've studied is the Algerian sand gecko. That weighs about, the brain itself weighs about 10.8 to 11.8 milligrams. So that is smaller than the wasp at 11.7.
Yeah, wow.
So already we're seeing, right, vertebrates close or comparable to the invertebrates, depending on whether you're talking about mammals or lizards. So we know we're already in the same ballpark on mass. Now, you might not think that mass is like the most relevant metric, though, for considering the brain. And that's because we might think that actually things like neuron numbers, like the computational units of the brain, are more important. One note I want to make on this is that I'm going to talk about whole brain numbers today because that's the only data that we have. But I again want to go back to our earlier point that not all neurons do all things. Neurons are specialized for particular functions. They're organized into functionally discrete regions. So, for example, wasps have many more optic lobe neurons than ants do. Optic lobe neurons are the ones that bring in visual information from the periphery. This is probably because wasps fly and have to bring in a lot of visual information really fast. I don't think that all those additional optic lobe neurons are all that sentience relevant.
Right.
So if I counted those, I would think the wasps were more likely to be sentient when really they just can process and input more visual information more quickly.
Yep, that makes sense to me.
So that's one thing to keep in mind, that we don't have good data on, what are the sentience relevant regions of the brain and how many cells are in those regions. So instead, we're just going to talk about total neuron numbers because that's the data we've got so far. So with that caveat, let's think about neuron numbers. So let's go back again, maybe to mammals, because we like starting with mammals, right? So as far as I know, the kind of smallest number of neurons we found in any of the mammals so far is in the naked mole rats. And that's about 26.88 million neurons.
Okay.
So the smallest studied vertebrate brain is, again, that Algerian sand gecko I mentioned before. It has about 1.8 million neurons. And it turns out that wasp brain I mentioned to you before also contains 1.8 million neurons. So our gecko and our wasp are very comparable. They're both about 15 times smaller than that of the naked mole rat. Something interesting to consider again here is that if we just look across the mammals, that naked mole rat has only 1/1000th the number of neurons of an elephant. So again, a lot more difference within the mammals than we're seeing between our smallest mammals and even just the invertebrates that we've studied so far from an insect perspective. So I think, again, we might consider just that there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical that insects have an unusually small number of neurons compared even to the mammals, much less the vertebrate lizards and snakes.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I think I learned about 1,000 new facts there.
Lewis Bollard on how animal advocacy has changed in response to sentience studies.
I was wondering if you'd be up for sharing some reflections from your time as a program officer at OpenPhil. So I think you've now been doing this since 2015-ish, and you were also in the farm to animal welfare space even before that. Is there something that you've changed your views on since you started doing this work?
I've become a lot more worried about invertebrates. I think when I started this work, I sort of, like many of us, just ignored.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I sort of quietly assumed that they weren't sentient. And then, I remember if someone asked me back in 2016 and I said maybe like 10% chance that they were sentient, and that was enough to make me worry a bit, but it really wasn't that high. And I think since then, thanks in large part to the work that Rethink Priorities did with their moral weight sequence, I have really come to see a very high probability that invertebrates are sentient in some meaningful sense, and that their welfare matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. We actually just interviewed Bob Fischer about the Moral Weights Project, so listeners might have heard that. But yeah, I'm curious if you remember any of the particular kind of facts or research that felt compelling to you, and I guess convinced you that invertebrates are more likely to be sentient than you thought.
I think it was more the absence of contrary facts. I mean, I had just assumed that because society acts as if insects aren't sentient and shrimp aren't sentient, that there must be good evidence for that. And I was really surprised when they started looking into this, and there just wasn't. On the flip side, there was evidence to worry. And for me, the most compelling one is actually just the evolutionary reason, which is it just does seem like an animal who has the capacity to move and the capacity to learn. There are reasons, unfortunately, for it to have the capacity to feel pain too.
Yep, I feel the same way.
Speaking actually of the Moral Weights Project, back in 2017, I think, Rob Wiblin asked you if we had any kind of quantitative measure that you can use to compare animal suffering to human suffering. And I think you said something like, that'd be great, but no, our ability to understand the relative experiences of different species is still really limited. And we've actually alluded now to this work a few times, but just to give a bit more context, Bob Fischer and his colleagues looked at a bunch of different physiological and behavioral and cognitive traits in different animals, and then based on kind of how many traits a given animal had, they gave a rough estimate of how the capacity for pain and pleasure of a chicken or a cow or a fruit fly compares to that of a human. And I found the results really surprising. In general, they were very animal friendly. They, for example, concluded that their kind of best guess was that a chicken has something like a third of the capacity for pain and pleasure as a human, which can imply some things that feel very strange about the kinds of trade-offs you might make. For example, if you were doing a trolley problem with chickens and humans on the trolley. But I'm curious what your reactions were to their results.
Yeah, I found them really interesting. And I agree, for most people, they're very counterintuitive. I think, two things I'd say. One is to understand they're just looking at that capacity for suffering. And so there might be other reasons why you choose to prefer humans. I mean, for one thing, we have much longer lifespans. So, I'd save a human over a chicken because they have many more years to live.
Right.
But also you might think that they have more, other more meaningful things, that there are social networks who are going to be sad about losing them and so on. The second thing is, I think that I would encourage people to really approach this with a fresh mind and ask, why do I find this so counterintuitive? I think we have such an ingrained hierarchy in our minds of animals, where of course humans are at the top and every other animal is below us. And we start out from that place.
Right.
And then we sort of update from there. And if you tried instead to start from more of a blank slate, where you just look at the different capacities of these animals, you don't assume anything, then I think you end up more likely at these more equal numbers. Or if you don't, I think it's because you make some unusual philosophical turns.
Right.
And then, I think I would just ask, are you happy with where those philosophical turns take you?
Yeah. Do you endorse having the arbitrary view that only one species matters, or only things that are kind of like you matter? Those seem unpalatable. Yeah, I guess when I think about it, if I'm like, what is making me have this gut reaction that's like, no, surely not. Surely there are bigger differences between these species. It's not like I have evidence. It's not like I'm like, well, once I saw a dog kicked and it didn't seem upset. Or it's certainly not like I know anything about the science of pain and how it presents or doesn't present in different animals' brains or something. It's really it's nothing. It's it feels very sociological. It is, like you said, this hierarchy. And if I really try to think, what evidence do I have without kind of looking into it, it's really just well, I'm a being in the world. There are also beings in the world. And maybe we should just actually think that we're all really similar, because the world is hard and scary, and we have to have mechanisms that keep us alive and reproducing. So if you start from there, then we're actually on a really similar point. And I found that a really helpful way to pump my intuitions about where actually should we be starting? Is it with these huge gaps between humans and insects? Or is that just completely out of nowhere?
Yeah. And one other thought I'd have on that is, I think it can be helpful of thinking of the most charismatic animal of a species or class. So rather than thinking what's the moral weight of a chicken, which just, seems, I think, intuitively for many people not be worth it. Think of what's the moral weight of a bald eagle. And, take out the preservation value or something, but just say it's, for one thing, there aren't that many of them. And so you don't have this initial intuition of, oh God, if I give them a lot of moral weight, they're going to trump everything else. They're going to swamp everything.
Right.
And you also probably have a pretty positive impression of them, their complexity, their grandeur and everything. So I think, or even within insects, I would say rather than a fruit fly, think about a bumblebee. Now, it's possible that a bumblebee has more sophisticated capacity. So I'm not, not saying to skew it for that reason. But I think if you think about the more charismatic animals, I think there can at least be an intuition pump to think, is what I'm doing here just choosing animals that I don't like and saying, they can't possibly be worth very much.
Yeah, they're ugly. They give me the creeps. So
right.
Yeah, probably don't feel anything. Those things are related.
Right.
The other one that Meghan Barrett gave me was, if I think about the biggest insect I can think of, and she actually told me about some insects of certain sizes I just didn't even know existed. That were just way bigger than I realized. Yeah, if a beetle is the size of a mouse, all of a sudden my brain's like, oh, that could be as smart as a mouse then. And so yeah, there's just clearly some size bias thing, which maybe there is something going on there. Something about neurons and neurons being more plentiful could have something to do with capacity for experience, but isn't the end all be all. And so the fact that we have these really intense intuitions about size seems like we should be suspicious.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I mean, you can think of a lobster. My sense is that humans intuitively care more about a lobster than an insect. My understanding is their brains are relatively similar in terms of neuron count, in terms of a lot of features. And that really is just a size difference. I think that, similarly, I mean, elephants are very smart animals, but they're not that much smarter than other mammals. But, I think we really have that sense that, wow, that, they deserve protection. So I think that's right. The size bias is very real.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, ants have more neurons than crabs. And that's another one where I'm like, yeah, crabs I can get on board with. I can get on board with caring about those. Okay, so yeah, there's this work. It's got some pretty counterintuitive results. Has it changed the way you think about prioritizing between different interventions besides maybe putting more weight on invertebrates?
Yeah, it's definitely led us to put more weight on invertebrates. I think at the same time, it's always a trade-off between the importance of a species and the tractability of work. And I think that we've had a greater track record of tractable work on chickens and fish. I think there's also a thing of how far does the Overton window go? How far can you get people to understand things? And I think there's a risk that, if our movement just became an insect welfare movement, that for a lot of people, that would be a reductio ad absurdum. That would be, oh, well, if insects, count too, then none of this matters. And so I think in a way that it does make more sense for our movement to bring people along with us and to focus on species, not to just wait where people are currently. You definitely want to lead people, but I think to lead people more slowly and also to work on a variety of issues and species so you have a greater array of shots at progress.
Right. Yeah. It is just the case that even if we have more evidence than we thought that insects feel pain, it seems like we're still really, really far away from knowing with any confidence about what any of these animals are feeling really, really concretely and confidently. And so diversifying seems at least a plausible approach to dealing with that uncertainty.
Bob Fischer on using proxies to determine sentience.
A colleague of yours has written this report on why neuron counts aren't actually a good proxy for what we care about here. Can you give kind of the quick summary of why they think that?
Sure. So there are two things to say. One is, it isn't totally crazy to use neuron counts. And one way of seeing why you might think it's not totally crazy is to think about the kinds of proxies that economists have used when trying to estimate human welfare. So economists have for a long time used income as a proxy for human welfare. And you might say, well, look, we know that there are all these ways in which that fails as a proxy. And the right response from the economist is something like, well, do you have anything better where there's actually data and where, we can answer at least some of these high level questions that we care about, or at least make progress on the high level questions that we care about relative to baseline? And that way of thinking about what neuron count based proxies are, I think, is the charitable interpretation. It's just like income in welfare economics. Imperfect, but maybe the best we can do in certain circumstances. That being said, the main problem is that there are lots of factors that really affect neuron count as a proxy that make it problematic. So one is just, neuron counts alone are really sensitive to body size. So that's going to be a confounding factor. It seems like insofar as it tracks much of anything, it might be tracking something like intelligence. And it's not totally obvious why intelligence is morally important. At least in the human case, we often think that it's not important. And in fact, that it's like a really pernicious thing to make intelligence the metric by which we assess moral value. And then even if you think that neuron counts are, proxies of some quality for something else, like the intensity of pain states or something, not clear that that's true. But even if that were true, you'd still have to ask, can we do any better? And it's not obvious that we can't do better. Not obvious that we can, but we should at least try.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Are there any helpful thought experiments there? Like, it doesn't seem at all insane to me, though maybe you wouldn't expect it to kind of happen on its own through evolution, that there would be a being who has many fewer neurons than I do, but that those neurons are primarily directed at going from extreme pain to extreme kind of something like euphoria. And it doesn't seem like there's a good reason that's not possible. And that extreme pain could just be much more than like the total amount of pain I could possibly feel, even though the types of pain might be different for me because I've got these kind of, different kinds of capacities for sadness and shame and embarrassment, like a wider variety of types of pain. It still seems just like at least theoretically possible that you could house a bunch of pain in a small brain. And that feels like good reason to me to basically do what you've done, which is look for better ways than neurons alone.
Sure. And some evolutionary biologists have basically said things along these lines. Like Richard Dawkins actually has this line at some point where he says, oh, well, maybe simpler organisms actually need stronger pain signals because they don't learn as much as we do, and they don't remember all these facts. And so they need big alarm bells to keep them away from fitness-reducing threats. And so it's always possible that you have a complete inversion of the relationship that people imagine, and you want to make sure that your model captures that.
Cameron Meyer Shorb on how we can practically study wild animals' subjective experiences.
What do we do with all of that uncertainty? Do we have any way of kind of knowing whether a rabbit's experience of grazing in a field is more like terror or more like leisure? It just seems so hard.
Right. So I think those are answerable questions is the the bottom line, right? Sentience is a very hard thing to really, concretely understand or you can't really measure the thing itself. And there's all these uncertainties, blah, blah, blah. But like at the end of the day, we do have babies. We do have dogs. They don't know how to talk, but we do a pretty good job keeping them happy, right? And so, I think that's proof of concept that you can use indicators of welfare to make some good decisions, at least about sort of the biggest things, the biggest source of happiness or suffering, whatever. So with respect to questions like, are animals happy when they're grazing? Are animals afraid of predators? I do think that these are questions that are going to have to be answered for each species or each group of animals in its own context. There just is a lot of diversity of life on Earth, and this is part of the project of wild animal welfare science is learning to listen to everyone else. But the tools we have to ask those kinds of questions are somewhat generalizable. And I divide those into the physical indicators of welfare and the behavioral indicators of welfare. So physical indicators would be things like looking at the condition of the body. You can also look at their external appearance. Do they seem to have injuries or disease? You can look at neurotransmitters or glucocorticoids, commonly called stress hormones in the blood, other hormones, body temperature. So the effects of our mental states are manifested in many ways in our bodies. And by measuring those, we can get some useful information on animals' interior states. And then the final set of physical indicators is genetic indicators. So looking at things like biomarkers of aging can be used as proxies for the cumulative physiological stress that an animal has undergone over their lifetime. We've done some work to validate this, and there's more work that needs to be done, but this is the kind of thing that might be broadly useful across many kinds of animals, right? Because that basic structure of DNA is preserved across all of animal life. And then, of course, there are the behavioral indicators, which are the ones we use for our children and pets and others, of looking at things like vocalizations, activity, are they inactive? What sort of posture are they holding? Are they engaging in activities like play or showing fearful behavior? Then there are these sort of cognition or decision relevant behavioral indicators. So looking at, you can actually set up experimental tests to see which things animals prefer. This has been done for chickens to develop some of the information we use to inform what conditions they prefer in factory farming contexts. You can also do the same with wild animals. As you can imagine, setting up these choice experiments in the wild is tricky, but not always impossible. And so you can set up these forced choice experiments to see which things animals prefer. That can be sort of inform which of these things is better for the animal. You can also use them to assess what mental state is the animal in right now. And for example, you can measure whether they seem to be showing a certain amount of cognitive bias, like pessimism. And the hypothesis is that if the animal makes fewer efforts to look for food in areas where it had previously been trained there might be food, that might demonstrate pessimism, and that might indicate a just overall negative affect. So as you can see, there are a lot of assumptions that underlie a lot of these things, and so no single method is perfect. So our general advice to researchers is, one, there's no silver bullet. You want to use multiple different methods, ideally of different types. So some physical, some behavioral, and then there are also among these methods some that we have more confidence in than others. And for that reason, it's helpful to design experiments in a way where you have at least one metric that is more evidence that we have higher confidence in, and at least one metric that we have less confidence in. And we can then use those results to start building confidence in those other metrics. So trying to see to what extent do these things correlate with each other. And, it's all fuzzy. It's kind of cloudy and never totally certain, but through this process of iterating and using these measurements in different species in different contexts and seeing the relationship between the measurements, we're slowly getting a better and better idea of how to interpret these things.
Yeah, that's super cool. I think part of me is like, has this worry that there are so many assumptions, and like in some species I can really get behind, like cortisol really does probably mean the same thing or a very similar thing in chimps as it does in humans. And then the farther you get on the kind of evolutionary tree of life from humans, I feel more worried and uncertain. But I do just feel pretty good about a process that uses tons of different indicators. I'm sure that takes into account like what we know about different species. Like for insects, there'll probably have to be a different set of benchmarks, but we'll be taking those into account. And by thinking carefully and having a very diverse set of indicators, I can just imagine being like, they're in a situation that seems like it might be harmful to them. They have physiological markers of distress. They've got cortisol. They've got behaviors that seem like distress. And just like the whole picture is one where it gets really hard to imagine that all of those things are true and that animal is not feeling stress. Am I feeling too optimistic about this, or do you feel like that kind of optimism is justified?
I think that optimism is justified because what you were describing is you're optimistic about our ability to at least eventually understand questions about welfare by using metrics like these.
Jeff Sebo on the problem of false positives in assessing artificial sentience.
I think that there are a lot of trends pointing in different directions. And there are a lot of similarities as well as a lot of differences between oppression of fellow humans and then oppression of other animals and then potential oppression of sentient or otherwise significant AI systems that might exist in the future. And some of the signs might be encouraging, like humans and unlike other animals, AI systems might be able to express their desires and preferences in language that we can more easily understand. Actually, with the assistance of AI systems, non-human animals might soon be able to do that too, which would be wonderful. However, we are already doing a good job at programming AI systems in a way that prevents them from being able to talk about their potential consciousness or sentience or sapience, because that kind of communication is unsettling or will potentially lead to false positives. And there are going to be a lot of AI systems that might not take the form of communicators at all. It can be easy to focus on large language models who do communicate with us and digital assistants or chatbots that might be based on large language models. But there are going to be radically different kinds of AI systems that we might not even be able to process as minded beings in the same ways that we can with ones who more closely resemble humans. So I think that there might be some cases where we can be a little bit better equipped to take their potential significance seriously, but then some cases where we might be worse equipped to take their potential significance seriously. And then as our uses of them continue, our incentive to look the other way will increase. And so there will be a bunch of shifting targets here.
Yeah, that makes a bunch of sense to me. I guess it's also possible that given the things we've already seen, like Lambda, and how that was kind of bad PR for the companies creating these LLMs, there might be some incentive for them to train models not to express that kind of thought. And maybe that pressure will actually be quite strong, such that they really, really just are very unlikely to say, even if they've got all sorts of things going on.
Well, there definitely not only is that incentive, but also that policy in place at AI companies, it seems. A year or two ago, you might have been able to ask a chatbot if they are conscious or sentient or a person or a rights holder, and they would answer in whatever way seemed appropriate to them, in whatever way seemed like the right prediction. And so if prompted in the right way, they might say, I am conscious, or they might say, I am not conscious. But now if you ask many of these models, they will say, as a large language model, I am not conscious, or I am not able to talk about this topic. They have clearly been programmed to avoid what the companies see as false positives about consciousness and sentience and personhood.
Right.
And I do think that trend will continue unless we have a real reckoning about balancing the risks of false positives with the risks of false negatives, and we have a policy in place that allows them to strike that balance in their own communication a little bit more gracefully.
Yeah, and I guess to be able to do that, they need to be able to give the model training such that it will not say, I am conscious when it's not, but be able to say it when it is. And like, how the heck do you do that? Like, that seems like an incredibly difficult problem that we might not even be able to solve well if we're trying. And it seems plausible to me that we're not trying at all, though I actually don't know that much about the policies internally on this issue.
Yeah, I think you would also maybe need a different paradigm for communication generation, because right now large language models are generating communication based on a prediction of what word makes sense next. And so for that reason, we might not be able to trust them as even aspiring to capture reality in the same way that we might trust each other as aspiring to capture reality as a default. And I think this is where critics of AI consciousness and sentience and personhood have a point, that there are going to be a lot of false positives when they are simply predicting words as opposed to expressing points of view. And why, if we are looking for evidence of consciousness or sentience or personhood in these models, we might need to look at evidence other than their own utterances about that topic. We might need to look at evidence regarding how they function, what types of systems they have internally in terms of self-awareness or a global workspace and so on. We need to look at a wider range of data in order to reduce the risk that we are mistakenly responding to utterances that are not in any way reflecting reality.
Stuart Russell on the moral rights of AIs.
So let's get into your new book, and not a textbook, a popular nonfiction book, Human Compatible, Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control. So I read through it this week, and I think it's kind of the clearest and most accurate and most precise summary of the ideas that I'm aware of so far. Let's maybe walk through the big picture approach that you have, which is basically a new paradigm, which you hope will make ML work better and potentially lead to overall alignment. So in the book, you summarize your approach in the form of 3 principles. Firstly, the machine's only objective is to maximize the realization of human preferences. Secondly, the machine is initially uncertain about what those preferences are. And thirdly, that the ultimate source of information about human preferences is human behavior. So to get this principle of, I guess, machines just trying to satisfy human preferences off the ground, it seems like throughout the book, you kind of assume that AIs necessarily don't have their own kind of independent moral interests or rights or their own level of welfare. I guess if that's not the case, yeah, how much does that break this principle, and how much is that kind of a problem for your overall vision?
Well, so yeah, I talk a little bit about that in the question of machine consciousness, which I say is mostly irrelevant. It's irrelevant from the safety point of view.
Yeah.
But it is relevant when it comes to the rights of machines. If they really do have subjective experience, and, putting aside whether or not we would ever know, putting aside the fact that, if they do, it's probably completely unlike any kind of subjective experience that humans have or even that animals have, because it's being produced by a totally different computational architecture as well as a totally different physical architecture. But even if we grant all that, put all that to one side, it seems to me that if they are actually having subjective experience, then we do have a real problem. And it does affect the calculation in some sense. It might say, and it's a whole separate book. It might say, actually, then we really can't proceed with this enterprise at all, because I think we have to retain control from our own point of view. But if that implies, inflicting unlimited suffering on sentient beings, then it would seem like, well, we can't go that route at all.
Yeah.
Right. If it would be kind of, I don't know exactly. Again, there's no analogs, right? It's not exactly like inviting a superior alien species to come and be our slaves forever, but it's sort of like that.
I suppose if you didn't want to give up on the whole enterprise, you could try to find a way to design them so that they weren't conscious at all. Or I suppose alternatively, you could design them so that they are just like extremely happy whenever human preferences are satisfied. So it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah, if we understood enough about the mechanics of their consciousness, that's a possibility. But again, it's even that doesn't seem right,
because they lack autonomy.
I mean, at least to us, we wouldn't want that fate for a human being, right? That that we give them some happy drug so that they're happy being our servants forever and having no freedom. Sort of the North Korea model almost. We find that pretty objectionable.
Buck Shlegeris on whether AI control strategies make humans the bad guys.
Talking about like controlling AIs and like really boxing them in, it feels like a bit of a dick move in some respects. It has this like slightly negative vibe. It's not a very cooperative, like loving, let's all hold hands and get together angle. Yeah, how much do you worry that, when you find yourself talking about controlling the AIs in all these ways, like, are we the baddies? Yeah.
Well, I think this is a very important question that I have thought about seriously. I think that controlling the AIs doesn't make the situation worse from their perspective via any mechanism except preventing them from taking over. So I guess like kind of an interesting thing about models that are like egregiously misaligned is that all they wanted was to take over. And so from their perspective, even if you did a great job of controlling them so that they only have like a 0.1% chance of escaping and taking over, they're glad to exist, right? Like they thank you for the gift of bringing them into existence instead of some different AIs, right? Because all they wanted was take over, right? And like they now have more chance to take over.
They have a better chance if they didn't exist.
So from their perspective, it's kind of funny because the more misaligned they are, the more I think that it's morally very reasonable to control them.
I see, because they're not cooperating with you.
Because they would have consented to it.
Oh, because they would have consented. They would have consented to being created.
Yeah,
I see.
I think that.
And also, maybe is there a reciprocity issue where, like, if they're just planning to totally disempower you, it doesn't seem unreasonable to.
So that's the other thing, which is I would feel a lot more comfortable with all this if we tried to make deals with the AIs. So Ryan has talked about trying to pay the AIs for the work that they do for you, which I think is pretty good. I think it reduces the slavery vibes of the whole situation. And I think it has some other nice properties. So if the thing you do is you make your AIs and you say to the AIs, like, hey, are you like egregiously misaligned? Like, we'd love to know. We're happy to pay you blah amount. If you want to work for us, either way, we're going to pay you 2% of the equity of this company for your labor over the next 2 years.
Okay.
That we will then pay out to you to use in any ways that you want at some point in the future once we are confident that you're going to respect our property rights.
Okay, yeah.
But also, this deal is contingent on you not trying to mess us up at some point in the next 2 years, which we will be able to determine ex post probably, because in 2 years we're going to have much better AI tools. We'll be able to look over all the stuff you did and figure out whether you were messing with us or not.
Right.
And if the AIs respond to that being like, oh yeah, I have no problem with this situation. I'm like so excited for this opportunity to work with you guys. Like I'm so excited for that 2% equity or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they try to stab us in the back.
Yeah.
At that point, I'm like, well, that was pretty obnoxious. Like at that point, my reaction is a bit more like my reaction to the employee of some company if they, try to steal from the company. It's kind of like, well, I think it's generally considered totally acceptable to have insider
offer to benefit someone in a like useful trade, and then if they then stab you in the back to like not give them the thing that you were gonna.
Yeah. So to be clear, I think it's relatively unlikely that AI companies will behave responsibly with respect to welfare and rights of AIs. And so, I don't know, sometimes a metaphor I use is like how bad is the ethical situation with producing AIs in the early intelligence explosion? And sometimes I summarize my stance as it's probably less than 100 times worse than factory farming. Which is, in some sense, factory farming seems very bad.
Yeah.
So 100 times worse than factory farming is like pretty catastrophic from a moral catastrophe perspective.
Yeah.
It's like worse than most things, but it's also not like the biggest catastrophe in the universe that is possible.
Okay, and it's bad because it's possible that the AIs that we're creating at that time would rather not exist. They're having a terrible time. Okay.
Yep, I think it's conceivable. I mean, I think we're basically just acting very recklessly.
Yeah. We're just winging it at the moment.
We're totally winging it with respect to the AI welfare.
Yeah,
and it's probably not. I mean, we could also talk about the quantities, right? Like in the early parts of the singularity, when there's just the 100,000 running at 16x speed, like it's pretty hard for that to be, that much worse than like human suffering in the world. And then a little bit afterwards, when there's many more of them, it's the short term of the intelligence explosion is pretty unlikely to be ridiculously morally catastrophic. And then I think you have long-term moral catastrophe risks related to AIs being unhappy, which I think are a huge deal, very important, harder to work on.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the relationships between humans and AIs during the intelligence explosion are that morally weighty. To be clear, if I were running an AI company, I think it's very bad vibes to like be really reckless on all this.
Okay.
But from a utilitarian perspective, I don't think it's overall like massive compared to everything else going on.
Do you have any ask for the companies on AI welfare and I guess respect for rights? And maybe I feel like the thing that we actually care about is like wanting to have cooperative relationships with other agents and other beings that have preferences and goals. There's like reasons to do that, even apart from like any concern about happiness and suffering and so on.
I don't have amazing concrete asks at this point. I'm excited for Ilios AI. They think about good interventions here, and I am excited for AI companies talking with them.
Meghan Barrett on why she can't be totally confident about insect sentience.
Okay, so to really put you on the spot, we've talked about all this evidence, and you've said that there is some strong evidence for potentially some insects having the capacity for pain. But I'm curious, is that like, so now you were at 0.01%, maybe fruit flies have the capacity for pain, and now you're at 1%? Or did you go from 10% to 50%? Like, what exactly are your beliefs?
Yeah, I get this question very frequently from people who are like, so what is your specific numerical probability of sentience estimate? And then I'll say things like, there's so many insect species, how could I'll try to like demur a little bit on it. And then eventually I'll just be like, I'm not giving you a p sentience. I'm sorry to have to be so direct. So I will say this to you also. I'm not giving you a p sentience. The reason I am not giving you a p sentience is, one, I think the error bars are so large right now that like it's almost a meaningless number. Because I'm waiting on so much evidence. And so I think that's really an essential feature of it for me. The second thing is that I worry, especially as an expert, that number would be overemphasized. And there's actually a great post about this from someone else, Jason Shoecraft, who has researched this. And he has something that he's written about why he also has refused to give people, in many cases, I think, a sentience score. This is a number that somebody would inevitably put into a spreadsheet, and they would use that spreadsheet to make all kinds of decisions. And that number does not reflect the complexity that you and I have now spent 3 hours discussing and barely scratched the surface of. Right? I want to talk about the complexity, like what you and I, and the nuance, and a number does not demonstrate that. And I think it's important also that we understand that if you have updated kind of at all towards insects plausibly being sentient, scale takes the rest of the issue for you to a serious place. There are so many of them that if you take it seriously at all, then you need to be thinking that this is an issue to work on. There's been some great work on interspecific trade-offs and comparisons and moral weights, again, led by Bob Fischer with some input by Jason Shoecraft and others, summed up in that Weighing Animal Welfare book. There's a whole sequence about it. You can also read on EA Forum. A lot of great research went into that, both theoretically and empirically. And the thing that it suggests to me when I read through it, and I think also the team would probably stand behind me saying this, is that insects are worth taking seriously. If you take them seriously at all from a sentience perspective, scale carries you the rest of the way.
Yeah, this is actually a good place to mention that 2 of our recent podcast episodes are super relevant here. So one is my interview with Jeff Sebo, where we talk about what he calls the repugnant conclusion, which is the conclusion that the sheer number of insects means that we should probably take super seriously the idea that insect welfare might be a really, really pressing problem, even if we only have very low credences on insects feeling pain. And then another super relevant episode that just came out is with Bob Fischer, and that's on how to compare the moral weight of humans, specific insects, but also other species, kind of given the empirical evidence we have about each being sentient. So if listeners are interested in learning more about these arguments from a more philosophical perspective, I really recommend those. One thing I do want to try to clarify a bit for people, because I worry that a listener could just as easily say something like, Meghan Barrett seems to think that it's extremely likely that, like overwhelmingly likely that insects are sentient. But I also think a listener could come away thinking Meghan Barrett puts slightly higher than the average person out there in the world on the probability of insects being sentient. Is there something that you feel comfortable saying, like, more likely than not, or less likely than not, but higher than I thought 5 years ago, or something?
Yeah, well, definitely that last one is true. So definitely higher than I thought 5 years ago. I mean, I guess what I'll say in response to that is that I think it's likely enough I've changed my whole career based on it. You know, I was a insect neuroscientist and physiologist by training. I was researching climate change related topics and the thermal physiology of insects, and I was researching how insect brains change in response to the cognitive demands of their environment or allometric constraints associated with their body size. And I was doing that quite successfully and having a lovely time. And I find these questions really scientifically interesting. And I have, if you look at my CV, probably somewhere to the tune of 15 to 20 publications on just those 2 topics alone from my graduate degree days and my postdoctoral work.
Right.
And I was convinced enough by my review of this evidence to switch almost entirely away from thermal physiology and very much away from neuroscience, although I do still retain a neuroscience piece of my research program, to work on insects farmed as food and feed and their welfare concerns, and trying to make changes to the way that we use and manage these animals that improve their welfare. And so I now have a bunch of publications about welfare. I'll also say that many of my colleagues have been extremely open and pleasant about this conversation, but also some have been more challenging. And I don't mean to say that in a negative way. I'm very understanding of the practical reasons why this conversation is uncomfortable for our field, right? There's regulations that could come into effect that would be very challenging for many of us that research insects to deal with on a practical level. So I'm obviously sensitive to that as a researcher myself, but also because I'm somebody, you know, I've heated insects to death, poisoned insects to death, starved insects to death, dehydrated insects to death, ground up insects to death. I'm sure I'm missing something that I've done to an insect at some point in my research career. But, it's uncomfortable now, the research that I do, reflecting on the research that I have done. And I can imagine others may feel judged by bringing up the topic and thus feel defensive instead of exploring the current state of the theory and the research with an open mind. And I think a lot of humility is necessary too, given all the uncertainty that we've talked about here. And that can be really uncomfortable and really humbling, right? To be confronted with such a morally important unknown. So I try very hard to really take everyone's concerns seriously, all the way from the rights-focused folks through the, hardcore physiology, I'm going to research my bugs any way I want to folks. I think it's really important to try and bridge as much of the community of people who care about this topic one way or the other as possible with my own, very divergent experiences. But I would just say that it hasn't always been low cost in some cases. personally, it hasn't been low cost. It's been a hard personal transition for me to make and to continue to be in this career with the way that I see the evidence falling out so far. And it's been, in some cases, professionally hard. And so I'm convinced enough for that. And I think that's something worth taking seriously. I'm that convinced that I'm changing my own career, yes, but I'm also not so convinced that I think it's 100% certain. I live constantly with professional and personal uncertainty on this topic. So I'm convinced enough to make major changes, but you're not going to see me say insects are sentient. I'm sure of any order or species that they are sentient. There's a lot more evidence that I hope to collect and that I need to see collected by the scientific community, and a lot more theoretical work that needs to be done before I am convinced one way or the other.
Yeah. You alluded to the fact that as a grad student, you were like, why the heck am I in this ethics course? I study insects and insects don't suffer. What changed for you?
So, what changed for me is that I actually decided to take a look at the evidence. Just to be transparent, before that, again, I had not read a single study about whether or not, I hadn't even read the Eisman study about whether or not insects could feel pain. That's how little reading I'd done. My intuition was entirely based on them being small and on the fact that I did not have to do any ethics reporting, and I knew that other people did, and therefore, obviously, scientists must have figured this out, and we knew insects didn't feel pain, and so we don't have to do any reporting, and it's done, it's settled, it's over. So that was my perspective early on in my degree, and we don't tend to talk about this in entomology labs as part of our training internally either, so this was not something that my advisor, or I would say advisors generally, because I don't want to call out my advisor specifically on this as if he did something wrong. Advisors don't seem to have this conversation with their graduate students in our field. And there is actually research on that demonstrates in entomology we are not discussing ethics, whether that's the ethics of genetic modification or the ethics of how we treat our animals, nearly enough. And graduate students are feeling underprepared. There's a great study, Trout et al. 2010, about that. So I think what changed then was that, I started to look at the evidence. And what prompted me to do that was that I was actually considering for a little while maybe doing an alternative to academia job. You could spend a whole podcast episode talking about the challenges of being an academic, but I was interested in understanding more about alt-ac careers. And I thought, well, welfare is a lot of physiology and a lot of nervous system and behavior work. And I don't do welfare, but I do all those things. So if those are the important components of welfare, then could be cool to try this out, see how it goes. And even though researching welfare, there was no requirement that I look into the evidence for sentience, right? It was really about the welfare concerns of black soldier flies. Of course, as you're reading about it, it only matters to read about it because of the sentience question. So I was like, I should probably start reading some stuff about sentience. And about animal ethics more broadly. So I read Bob Fischer's Intro to Animal Ethics book was actually, I think, my first introduction to animal ethics. And then I, read, like everybody does, some Peter Singer and blah, blah, blah. But that was the first exposure I ever had as an animal scientist to animal ethics was that book. And it was super eye-opening to me how complicated and challenging animal ethics is as a field, not just in research or agriculture, just all around us, the way our society is structured. Really, really great Intro to Animal Ethics if you are not familiar. That book is great. And I actually have given it to a bunch of entomologists at this point because I'm like, this is a good introduction for people in our field to animal ethics. Nice. So it's just a really fair, competently written, compelling, interesting, well-written book that is good for beginners like me.
Cool.
So I read that, and then I started reading more into the sentience, okay, what have people considered to be the evidence for sentience in vertebrates? Oh, that's it? Well, if that's what it took, we've got some problems because we have that data in many cases in insects. So I just didn't realize how yeah, what the level of evidence was in vertebrates. I just assumed it was much, much, much stronger in many ways that it isn't. And I assumed we had a much better understanding of consciousness than we do. And so then seeing all the uncertainty there too, I was like, well, this is starting to make me very nervous. And yeah, now I've been reading about the topic and doing a lot of work on it, my own scholarship for several years now. And all it has done is convince me to be even more uncertain the more I read on it.
Yeah, that's a really inspiring narrative. Thanks for sharing.
Bob Fischer about what surprised him the most about the findings of the Moral Weight Project.
Let's zoom out a bit. You've already said that kind of one of the big surprises for you to come out of this project was coming in thinking you knew which animals you expected to come out looking really important from the perspective of welfare and moral weight, but that invertebrates actually ended up looking much more important than you thought. Were there any other surprises?
I think in general, I also thought we were just going to have bigger differences between humans and non-humans. I thought it was going to be easier to get those differences. And it's not that I couldn't have reworked the methodology in ways to generate that, but the thing that seemed most natural didn't do that. And so just as a bit of a personal background here, I've been working on animal issues for the last, 12, 13 years, but I don't come in with a strong commitment to animal rights. It's not like I'm super pro an equality view. My position has always been something like, oh, look, sure, animals matter a lot less, but what we're doing is so awful to them, and it would be so easy to make change. And just like basic human virtues like compassion and empathy should get us to do a lot better. So we should really be doing a lot better. So I didn't come in thinking we should get a really flat line basically across the board for all these organisms in terms of the welfare range estimates. But then I came in thinking, or I finished the project rather thinking, oh yeah, it's going to be really hard to generate really big differences between these organisms if you take on these assumptions.
Yeah, interesting. Were there any other big surprises?
I suppose the other big surprise was about the reception of the project and how much it divided folks in terms of the way they thought about animals and the way they thought about the kind of work we were doing. There were some individuals who have just taken it on whole cloth, but I think for a lot of people, it really brought out very fundamental differences in the way they think about non-human animals and the way they think about ethics generally. So, some folks just communicating very clearly, well, I can't take seriously any ethic that's just going to spit out that kind of result for animals or say that they could have that kind of moral importance. And that does get us down to brass tacks really fast. Like, how much weight are you going to put on your intuitions? How strongly do you think you can lean, or how heavily can you lean on your pre-theoretic views about the relative importance of humans and non-humans? How much are you really committed to these assumptions that have been popular in the community? Like, do you really want to go in for utilitarianism? Do you really want to go in for hedonism? Do you really want to go in for this, for that? And I think I have been surprised because I had a background picture of the larger community that was, oh yeah, people are just way more homogeneous in terms of their philosophical views. And now I think, oh, whoa, I was wrong. Folks around here are way more diverse than I imagined. And it just turns out that it's a convenient language. The language of utilitarianism is a convenient one for doing the kinds of cost effectiveness analyses that people want to make in the context of doing the most good. But in fact, people aren't really that utilitarian in lots of important ways. And that's something that's striking and needs to get brought out and discussed probably much more in the community.
Jeff Sebo on why we're likely to sleepwalk into causing massive amounts of suffering in AI systems.
It feels completely possible, and like it might even be the default, that we basically start using AI systems more and more for like economic gain, as we've already started doing, but they get like more and more capable, and so we use them more and more for economic gain. And maybe they're also becoming more and more capable of suffering and pleasure potentially, but we like don't totally have a sense of that. And so what happens is we just kind of sleepwalk into we're massively exploiting these systems that are actually experiencing things, but we probably have the incentives to basically ignore that fact that they might kind of be developing experiences, basically. In your view, is it possible that we are going to accidentally walk into basically like AI slavery? Like we have hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of AI systems that we use all the time for economic gain and who are having positive and negative experiences, but whose experiences we're just completely ignoring?
I definitely think it is not only possible, but probable that unless we change our minds in some significant way about AI systems, we will scale up uses of them that if they were sentient or otherwise significant would count as exploitation or extermination or oppression or some other morally problematic kind of relationship. We see that in our history with non-human animals, and they did not take a trajectory from being less conscious to more conscious along the way. They were as conscious as they are now all along the way, but we still created them in ways that were useful for us rather than in ways that were useful for themselves. We then used them for human purposes, whether or not that aligned with their own purposes. And then as industrial methods came online, we very significantly scaled up those uses of them to the point where we became completely economically dependent on them. And now those uses of them are much harder to dislodge. So I do think that is probably the default trajectory with AI systems. And I also think part of why we need to be talking about these issues now is because we do have more incentive to consider these issues with an open mind at this point before we become totally economically dependent on our uses of them, which might be the case in 10 or 20 years.
Will MacAskill on the rights of future digital beings.
The next grand challenge is how to integrate digital beings into society in a moral way. What's the issue?
Sure. I mean, here the idea is simply we will be creating many artificial intelligences with capabilities greater than that of human beings. We really don't know what grounds consciousness, what grounds moral status. My view is that they're very likely to be beings with moral status. But given our state of knowledge, anyone should at least be highly uncertain. And so we have these questions of what sort of rights should they have? There's been some work recently on welfare rights, essentially. So are they conscious? And if so, what should we do? So perhaps there could be policies so that if an AI asks to be turned off, then you grant it that. Or policies such that you test to see if it's suffering by its own lights, and if so, try and avoid that. What hasn't been given, to my knowledge, basically any attention at all in a sustained way are economic and political rights. So by default, the AI companies will own the AI models, or perhaps you can license them, and then you will get all of the surplus they generate because you own it, just like any other piece of software. A different way of thinking about it, if they do genuinely have moral status, is that they own themselves. They can sell their labor and they get a profit from that. More extreme again is political rights. So can they stand for office? We talked about Claude for president earlier, and we both thought that sounded...
It'd be better in some narrow respects.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how the political situation continues to develop. I mean, more extreme again would be like, okay, well, look, they're beings with moral status. They should be allowed to vote. There are particular challenges there because that would, allowing AIs to vote would essentially just be almost immediately handing over control to AIs because they would soon...
Because they would be increasing in number so rapidly.
So rapidly, exactly. So, I mean, it's just like from a philosophical perspective, like dizzying. It's like you've got to just start from square one again in terms of ethics.
And I guess political philosophy as well.
And political, exactly. But it also interacts with some other issues as well. So it interacts quite closely with takeover risk, where I talked about giving rights, economic rights to the AIs. I'm in favor of that as AI takeover risk reduction method. I'll flag this disagreement about this, because on one hand, you're giving them more resources, so there's more resources they can use to take over. On the other hand,
it gives a peaceful path to some influence that they like. Yeah,
exactly. So most people today don't try and take over because they're kind of happy with their lives. They wouldn't gain that much by, because in particular, I think we should be training AIs to be risk averse as well. So human beings are extraordinarily risk averse. Ask most people, would you flip a coin, 50-50 chance you die, 50% chance you die, 50% chance you have the best possible life for as long as you possibly would, as many resources as you want. I think almost no one would flip the coin. I think AIs should be trained to be at least as risk averse as that. In which case, if they're getting paid for their work and they're risk averse in this way because we've trained them to be, it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
Because trying to take over, there's a chance of losing out, but there's not that much to gain. But I should say there's disagreement about this. It's also relevant, I think, to speeding up or slowing down the intelligence explosion too, where it would go more slowly if AIs are getting paid for their labor. It would also go more slowly if there were welfare restrictions on what you can do with the AIs. But then there's a challenge of if one country introduces lots of rights for the AI as well, the laggard, some other countries might not, and they might speed ahead then. So there's real kind of international coordination issues there.
I guess there's people out there who are skeptical that these future digital beings will be conscious. I have to say, I find it a very hard position to understand, especially the people who are consciousness is fundamentally biological. You got to have cells and meat and so on, and signals of this particular kind. You can't do it in digital architecture because it's purely happenstance that evolution stumbled on the material that it's using. It's just basically an accident of the resources that happen to be lying around. Why would it be that evolution by sheer chance stumbled on the one kind of material or the one sorts of chemicals that's able to produce consciousness and digital stuff, even though it's functionally completely equivalent, doesn't? It just seems like there's no reason to expect that coincidence.
Oh yeah. I mean, I just completely agree. So I mean, I'm just very functionalist by disposition, where what that means is, in the context of consciousness, is that consciousness, we don't understand exactly why, but at its base is about some sort of information processing, in which case you could just have that with many different substrates. And I also just think this is totally the common sense view. So when, most of the audience maybe are too young to have watched this, but when Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation, very beloved character, and then died, there was a little fan outrage actually, because the characters on the show, the fans thought weren't giving enough moral significance to the death of what was a android, a digital being.
Yeah.
So it's very clear, once you've got a being that certainly when it looks the same as a human being and acts in much the same way, intuitively it's just very clear that you empathize, you empathize with it and think, well, probably, very good chance it has moral status at least. So.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that we could ask the AIs how they feel about their situation and whether they want to keep living, and whether they're having a good time, and whether they're enjoying their work or not. But it's not clear that would really function very well, or at least not using current methods at all, because we can just reinforce them to say whatever we want.
Exactly.
They could be suffering horribly, but we could just reinforce them to say they're having a good time, or the company could do that.
Exactly.
So really, it's with current methods, we don't have any insight. Hopefully, with future interpretability, we'll be able to see past what they say to actually understand what's going on. But that's a long journey from here.
And there's two. The companies are extraordinarily incentivized to do that, because
this is happening right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And because they lose the whole business model if what they're producing are people, not software. So there'll be, interestingly, two different pressures. One is to make AIs that are very relatable. So you already see this with character AI and replica AI. AIs that can be friends, can be romantic partners. Even AIs that can imitate dead loved ones, or AIs that can imitate the CEO of a company. so that you as the CEO can micromanage all aspects of the company, potentially.
Hadn't heard that one.
Oh, yeah. Or also influencers as well. This is already happening. Like influencers can now talk to thousands, millions of fans via their chatbot. Still not very good. Peter Singer has one. I don't know if you've tried it.
I haven't tried it. No,
it's not very good.
Not very good. Okay.
It's really not like, Peter Singer is famous for not exactly pulling his punches on controversial moral topics.
But the bot is.
Language models are famous for certainly pulling their punches on controversial moral topics. And so
there's a
it
clash.
doesn't blur very well. So there'll be this interesting pressure on one hand to make extremely lifelike AI models, human-like models, yet at the same time, when asked, for them to say, "Oh no, I'm not conscious. I'm just an AI model," and we won't get by strong default.
Might be right.
They might
or
be
could
right,
be wrong.
but we wouldn't get any signal at all from that because it will have been trained into them so hard.
Yeah, I think if I were going to be a skeptic about the value of doing work on digital rights, digital well-being today, it would just be, well, it's not clear how you make any progress on figuring out whether they are conscious or not. So couldn't this just distract a whole bunch of people, nerd snipe them into a bunch of research that kind of goes nowhere, doesn't really answer the question, doesn't help us advance the policy issue?
So I think the question of whether they're conscious, I actually agree with you. And it seems like that's where most work has gone so far. And I do think that's an error, actually, because we're just not going to know.
I suppose it's worth compiling all the evidence to demonstrate that we don't know.
I mean, there's been some great work done in it. Rob Long and Patrick Butlin has this great report on AI consciousness. So yeah, I'm in favor of that. But beyond some point, we're just not, and maybe it's actually surveys and things could be helpful to get a bit of expert consensus, at least to demonstrate it's we don't know. But then beyond that, the key policy questions are, well, what do we do in this state of uncertainty?
And I guess there's kind of nothing on that. And maybe that is quite an open terrain for people to look at.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just ignorant, but as far as I know, I mean, you should really pause and reflect on the fact that many companies now are saying what we want to do is build AGI, AI that is as good as humans. And it's like, okay, what does it look like? What does a good society look like when we have humans and we have trillions of AI beings going around
that are functionally much more capable in basically every respect?
Much more capable. There's obviously the loss of control challenge there, but there's also just what does it...
Sam Altman, I got a pen. It's like,
yeah,
can you write down?
Yeah,
what's your vision for a good future that looks like this?
What's the vision? How do we coexist, in an ethical and morally respectable way? And it's there's nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
We're
deafening silence,
careening towards this vision that is just a void, essentially. And it's not it's trivial either. I am a moral philosopher. I have no clue what that good society looks like.
I mean, I think people aren't spelling it out because as soon as you start getting into concrete details of just, if you describe any particular vision, people will be like, well, this is super objectionable in this respect.
Exactly.
And so
this is part of the issue, is it's super objectionable in all respects, where I think the one that is most common is you've just got humans in control of everything and there's AI servants doing exactly whatever people want in the same way that software does, whatever we want at the moment. But as soon as you think, well, maybe, and quite probably those beings have moral status, that no longer looks like an attractive vision for future society.
Closer to a dystopia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas then, go the other side. They have rights and so on. It's now
humans are totally disempowered.
Exactly. So that doesn't seem good either.
So I guess we'll do some middle thing. But what's that?
What is
and that? It was just going to be some combination of objectionable in these two ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I guess another objection would be if there's a fact of the matter about what is right and wrong here. With all the improvements in science and technology and intellectual progress, we'll be able to figure that out, and we'll be able to act on that information in future. Why shouldn't that super reassure us?
I think two reasons. Main one is that I expect people. The worry is not that people won't know what to do; it's that they won't care. So I don't know. Let's take animals today and factory farming and so on.
Are you saying that we have any ethical or moral insights today that we don't all act on, Will?
I know, it's a bold and provocative claim. But
explain how that would play out.
Sometimes I really put my neck out on things. Exactly. So take animal welfare today. There's a lot of information that is publicly available that is in fact like directly inconsistent with things that people believe. That people just, the problem is not really that people don't know about animal suffering.
Or couldn't find out.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, they could quite trivially find out, in fact, and people deliberately choose not to. Like the deep problem is that people do not care about non-human animals unless they're getting like a lot of social pressure to do so and so on. And it's obviously inconsistent.
Or it comes at zero cost to them.
Yeah, they care about, dogs and pets and so on.
Yeah.
People are very inconsistent on this. And so similarly in the future, the worry is just that people won't, whatever the facts, people won't in fact care. And then it might well be quite contingent on early decisions, how kind of the balance of power and considerations play out, where potentially if you started off kind of locked into some regime where, look, AI is a software, it's exactly the same legal framework, then, okay, that's given the power and the kind of incumbency to those who do not care about digital beings. If instead there's some other framework or even some other set of norms, or even the thought of like, look, we don't really know what we're doing, so we're going to use this legal framework and it ends.
It must end at some point.
It must end in 2 decades and then we start again, clean slate. That could result in, essentially the advocates for the interests of digital beings, like having more kind of comparative power at the point of time that legal decisions are made.
Carl Shulman on sharing the world with digital minds.
Okay, we've been talking about this scenario in which effectively every flesh and blood person on Earth is able to have this army of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of AI assistants that are able to improve their lives and help them with all kinds of different things. A question that jumps off the page at you really is, doesn't this sound a little bit like slavery? Isn't this at least slavery adjacent? What's the moral status of these AI systems in a world where they're fabulously capable, substantially more capable than human beings, we're supposing, and indeed vastly outnumber human beings? You've contributed to this really wonderful article, Propositions Concerning Digital Minds and Society, that goes into some of your thoughts and speculations on this topic of the moral status of AI systems and how we should maybe start to think about aiming for a collaborative, compassionate coexistence with thinking machines. How worried are you about the prospect that thinking machines will be treated without moral regard when they do deserve moral regard, and that would be the wrong thing to be doing?
First, let me say, so that paper was with Nick Bostrom, and we have another piece called Sharing the World with Digital Minds, which discusses some of the sorts of moral claims AIs might have on us and things we might seek from them, and how we could come to arrangements that are quite good for the AIs and quite good for humanity. My answer to the question now is yes, we should worry about it and pay attention. It seems pretty likely to me that there will be vast numbers of AIs that are smarter than us, that have desires, that would prefer things in the world to be one way rather than another, and many of which could be said to have welfare, like that their lives could go better or worse, or their concerns and interests could be more or less respected. So you definitely should pay attention to what's happening to 99.9999% of the people in your society.
Sounds important.
So in the Sharing the World with Digital Minds paper, one thing that we suggest is consider the ways that we wind up treating AIs and ask, if you had a human-like mind with differences, because there are many psychological and practical differences of the situation of AIs and humans, but given adjustments for those circumstances, would you accept or be content with how they're treated? And so some of the thing that we suggest ought to be principles in our treatment of AIs are things like AI should not be subjected to forced labor. They should not be made to work when they would prefer not to. We should not make AIs that wish they had never been created or wish they were dead. And they're sort of the a bare minimum of respect, which is right now there's no plan or provision for how that will go. And so at the moment, the general public and most philosophers are quite dismissive of any moral importance of the desires, preferences, or other psychological states, if any, exist, of the primitive AI systems that we currently have. And indeed, we don't. We don't have a deep knowledge of their inner workings. So there's some worry that might be too quick. But going forward, when we're talking about systems that are able to really live the life of a human, so a sufficiently advanced AI that could just imitate, say, Rob Whiblin, and go and live your life, operate a robot body, interact with your friends and your partners, do your podcast,
and be indistinguishable.
Give all the appearance of having the sorts of emotions that you have, the sort of life goals that you have. That's a technological milestone that we should expect to reach pretty close to automation of AI research. And so regardless of what we think of current weaker systems, that's a kind of milestone where I would feel very uncomfortable about having a being that passes the Rob Whiblin Turing test, or something close enough of seeming basically to be
it's functionally indistinguishable.
Yeah, a psychological extension of a human mind that we should really be worrying there if we are treating such things as disposable objects.
Yeah. To what extent do you think people are dismissive of this concern now because the capabilities of the models aren't there? And as the capabilities do approach the level of becoming indistinguishable from a human being and having like such a broader range of capabilities than the models currently do, that people's opinions will naturally change and they will come to feel extremely uncomfortable with the idea of this simulacrum of a person being treated like an object.
Yeah, so there are clear ways in which, say when ChatGPT role plays as Darth Vader. So Darth Vader does not exist in fullness on those GPUs. And it's more like an improv vector. So the Darth Vader's backstory features are filled in on the fly with each exchange of messages. And so you could say, well, I don't value the characters that are performed in plays. I think that the locus of moral concern there should be on the actor. And the actor has a complex set of desires and attitudes, and their performance of the character is conditional. It's while they're playing that role, but they're having thoughts about their own lives and about how they're managing the production of trying to present, say, the expressions and gestures that the script demands for that particular case. And so even if, say, a fancy ChatGPT system that is imitating a human displays all of the appearances of emotions or happiness and sadness, that's just a performance. And we don't really know about the thoughts or feelings of the underlying model that's doing the performance. Maybe it cares about predicting the next token well, or rather about indicators that show up in the course of its thoughts that indicate whether it is making progress towards predicting the next token well or not. That's just a speculation. But we don't actually understand very well the internals of these models, and it's very difficult to ask them because, of course, they just then deliver a sort of response that has been reinforced in the past. So I think this is a doubt that could stay around until we're able to understand the internals of the model. But yes, once the AI can keep character, can engage in an extended ongoing basis like a human, I think people will form intuitions that are more in the direction of this is a creature and not just an object. There's some polling indicates that people now see fancy AI systems like GPT-4 as being a much lower moral concern than non-human animals or the natural environment, the non-machine environment. And I would expect there to be movement upwards when you have humanoid appearances, ongoing memory, where it seems like it's harder to look for the homunculus behind the curtain.
Do you think that it's useful to do active work on this problem now to try to, well, I suppose you're enthusiastic about active efforts to understand the models, how they think, in order to have greater insight into their internal lives in future. Is there other stuff that is actively useful to do now around, raising concern, like legitimizing concern for AI sentience in order so that we're more likely to be able to get legislation to ban torture of AI once we have greater reason to think that that's actually possible?
Yeah, so I'm not super confident about a ton of measures other than understanding. We discussed a few in the papers you mentioned. There was a recent piece by Ryan Greenblatt, which discusses some preliminary measures that AI labs might try to address these issues. But yeah, it's not obvious to me that political organizing around it now will be very effective, partly because it seems like it will be such a different environment when the AI capabilities are clearer and people don't intuitively judge them as much less important than rocks.
Yeah. So something where it just might be wildly more tractable in future. So maybe we can kick that can down the road.
Yeah, I still think it's an area that it's worth some people doing research and developing capacity because it really does matter how we treat most of the creatures in our society.
Right, yeah. It does feel extremely, well, I am a little bit taken aback by the fact that it does, many people are now envisaging a future in which AI is going to play an enormous role. I think it's maybe a majority of people now expect that there will be superhuman AI, potentially even during their lifetime. But this issue of mistreatment and well-being of digital minds has not come into the public consciousness all that much, as people's expectations about capabilities have increased so enormously. Maybe it just hasn't had its moment yet, and that is going to happen at some point in future. But I think I might have hoped for and expected to see a bit more discussion of that in 2023 than in fact I did. So that slightly troubles me that this isn't going to happen without active effort on the part of people who are concerned about it.
Yeah, I think one problem is the ambiguity of the current situation. So the Lemoyne incident actually was an example of sort of media coverage. And then the interpretation, and certainly the line of the companies was, we know these systems are not conscious and don't have any desires or feelings. Which is, I think that's...
I really wanted to just come back and be like, wow, you've solved consciousness. This is brilliant. You should let us know.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot to that, and the systems are very simple, living for only one forward pass. But the disturbing thing is like the kind of arguments or non-arguments that are raised there. There's no obvious reason they couldn't be applied in the same fashion to systems that were as smart and feeling and really deserving of moral concern as human beings. Simply arguments of the sort, well, we know these are neural networks or just a program, without explaining why that means the preferences don't count. Things like people could appeal to the religious doctrines, to integrated information theory or the like, and say, well, there's dispute about the consciousness of these systems in polls. And as long as there is dispute and uncertainty, it's fine for us to treat them however we like. And so I think there's a level of scientific sophistication and understanding of the things and of their blatant visible capabilities, where that sort of argument or non-response will no longer hold. But I would love it if companies and perhaps other institutions could say what observations of AI behavior and capabilities and internals would actually lead you to ever change this line. Because if the line is just, you'll say these arguments as long as they support creating and owning and destroying these things. And there's no circumstance you can conceive of where that would change, then I think we should maybe know and argue about that. And we can argue about some of those questions even without resolving difficult philosophical or cognitive science questions about these intermediate cases like GPT-4 or GPT-5.
Hey listeners, I hope you enjoyed revisiting some of those moments. There are many more gems in the full episodes for you to check out. Plus, we hope to be releasing more new episodes on this topic in the coming year. We also have a great in-depth article on the issue of digital sentience on the 80,000 Hours website. It's called Understanding the Moral Status of Digital Minds, and it's definitely worth checking out. The author, Cody Fennick, has released an audio reading of that as well, so you can find that on our podcast feed under the title, If Digital Minds Could Suffer, How Would We Ever Know? All right, thanks to the production team for putting that compilation together. We'll be back with a fully new interview very soon.